Greetings, everybody. I'm Salvador Cordova. Welcome to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. We explore evidences and reasons for the Christian faith. This is the after show for Dr. James Carter. I can't believe he has time for us. I know he has to pick up his kids. But Dr. Carter, if you'd like to just come on board and say a couple words, and same for Creation Myths. I know that you have to pick up your kids too. I'd like to congratulate you gentlemen on a very excellent show with opposing viewpoints. I think both sides could learn a lot and refine their understanding of these topics by listening to such discussions. It was very refreshing to hear a technical exchange between two professors of science, and rather than the usual flame throwing that we see on modern day debate. And I appreciate hearing the criticisms and comments on both sides. And so one reason that I open the StreamYard link is because if people don't come, I'm going to have to do a monologue, and that won't last very long. So anyway, so the topic was this long-term evolution experiment by Richard Lenski. And I know some people will challenge my references to Michael Behe, and that's perfectly fine. I think there's certainly things even that I've seen that Michael Behe has said. It's like, okay, well, maybe we could refine that argument and the definitions. For example, I am not a big fan of the term irreducible complexity. I personally advocated the idea of unevolvable complexity that will be a little better. Let me see if I'm going to drop the link here. Dr. Dan requested I drop the link. And I'm trying to get it to pin the message, and it was giving me a little bit of a hard time. So I'm going to also pin the link. So we have 10 people here. So I think, to be honest, I've been focusing on so many other things than Lenski's experiment. I actually felt that we're just going to let it play out. There are, everyone has their specialty. There are people that have really focused on that experiment. And Dr. Carter, I know you have to pick up your kids. And I know you're worn out. I don't know how you university professors manage to have a family and still work and do research and teach classes. Even
if it's not for the regular stuff that's on your calendar, it's the unexpected stuff too. Like, I had some family issues come up this week. My aunt passed away, and so I thought I was going to be preparing for this all week, and I basically didn't even get started until yesterday and wrapped stuff up this morning. So I'm just really exhausted, but it was good because I was able to get enough stuff out there that we could have a good discussion and get some feedback from Dr. Dan. And I got to comb through some of my references better now that I have some time. And so, yeah, I appreciated his input, feedback.
Yes, I think this is a good exercise. And I've tried to say that in the past, the creation science, intelligent design movement was just so focused on converting people that sometimes there were shortcuts taken where what I thought were actually valid criticisms were usually brushed aside, and they just kept moving forward. I think we're now in the situation, because I mean, personally, this is my opinion, that the design argument now is stronger than I've ever seen it. We can actually sit back a little bit and say, hey, you guys actually have a good point. We can kind of correct these ideas. One of the issues that I clearly saw was the issue of fitness. And I've criticized the evolutionary definition of fitness. We can have gene losses, and that's counted as if it increases reproduction. And I said, this is just a terrible situation. You can come up with all sorts of conclusions that you're improving fitness and make it seem that you're evolving complexity.
Well, it's like the race car analogy that I've seen you use and Dr. Samford about, okay, if you need a car to go as fast as possible, you can jettison the rear seat and passenger seat, get rid of the headlights, tail lights, lots of things you could get rid of to make it go faster. But what if you need to race at night, or what if you're put into a not non-artificial or isolated environment, then you've just gotten rid of some crucial things that aren't coming back in that particular cell lineage. Group is here, can't tell
this is just out of respect for Dapper Dino. I'm just posting his comment here, even though that's way beyond topic. Dapper, thank you for dropping in.
And their Bones of Contention book or something. I haven't read that yet.
Yeah. So
I can't answer.
Yeah,
I know almost nothing about
that.
paleontology either.
If your criticism is right, it's right. I'm not going to try to defend something I don't understand. I get into big trouble if I do that. So
they might have had an erratum somewhere, or they might have already addressed it.
Yeah. So I don't touch paleontology. I like the biochemistry and also cell biology and microbiology. And it's really nice that we have a biochemist, an organic chemist married to a microbiologist. I can't imagine a better team to be exploring this.
At least when we talk about things, there's enough overlap between the two fields that we can understand each other. She often wants me to cover the metabolism stuff, those lectures, because those are such doozies to have to deal with. And I have to keep asking her, like, what is the difference between these pathogens again? I'm teaching pathology right now. And so, of course, a lot of that is bacterial and viral diseases.
And I mean, to Dr. Dan's credit, I like some of his criticisms when he's talking about fitness and does it necessarily lead to extinction. I actually think that's a very good criticism, because some of the framing of genetic entropy, and it's a little bit ambiguous in some of the genetic entropy literature, does this necessarily mean extinction or not? And if we have to revise that, that's perfectly fine.
What do you think about Sanford's work with the influenza virus that they recovered from, I think, the 1918 Spanish flu, and then they found that that original one went extinct a couple of years ago because of air catastrophe, or what they say is genetic entropy?
Again, that's not anything that I'm involved in. Now, this puts me in a difficult situation since I'm still under contract for him. So,
hey, at least you have his contact information.
Now, to his credit, I said that. I mean, I think I'm free to share this. I said, Dr. Sanford, I agree with you 95%, and there are a few things that I don't agree with, and in good conscience, I have to. If people ask me these questions, I may express my disagreement. Is that okay? He said yes. Okay,
it looks like that's going to be another good conversation. Dr. Cardinal said we could do another hour on H1N1 flu, and Dapper Dino said that it actually never went extinct. So that would be interesting to get to the bottom of that.
And that's one of the things. It's like, and I said that's just a terrible choice of words. And even in some of what he had written, he said it's probably lying around, or at least he's conveyed that to me. It's probably lying around somewhere, but it's certainly
in
not.
A bioweapons lab.
Yeah, or there's some organism probably acting as a host to it, and that's what he meant. But that's what I was trying to tell John. You got to be a lot more careful with your choice of words. If your critics point that out, we need to revise your choice of words, because it's just because you may have a good argument, but if they're really bent on criticizing you, that's what they're going to focus on. And so even in the last year, I was saying, we had mathematicians join his team. In fact, one of them's known because his co-author, his lead author in the journal Mathematical Biology, just very adeptly wrote a criticism of Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, and that broke the record for all the downloads on that particular journal.
Tell me his name. I'm so tired. I was trying to
William
think of his name
Basner,
to tell
emeritus
Dan,
professor.
What is it?
Bill Basner, William Basner, or Bill Basner, emeritus professor at Rochester, and now he's teaching at UVA.
Is that the one that worked with him to extrapolate backwards that, based on the current mutation rates, you could get to an Adam and Eve roughly 6,000 years ago?
It may be.
I thought he was working with a mathematician. That's
Well, he's worked with a
And
lot of mathematicians because that's not, I mean, he said this publicly, that's not his specialty. So he's had to usually complement his
right.
support from people that do know math. That's actually one reason I got recruited, because
Nice.
even though I knew nothing about biology at the time, 7 years ago, I had the computational physics and math background and engineering. So
even though I take biostatistics, there's no way I trust myself and to know it well enough that we don't recruit statisticians whenever we're designing and publishing our research. So it's can't know it all.
I'm just inviting Otangela Grasso to come in, and I'm going to put the StreamYard link because Dr. Carter is about to go pick up his kids. We'll continue these conversations when your schedule's a little more sane. Yeah. I don't know how you do it, and I would love to talk more about biochemistry and organic chemistry. I actually was reviewing it, and I was just like, oh my goodness, Dr. Tour's right. I mean, I knew it, but then when I studied, I'm just like, my eyes were practically popping out. So so people wonder why I didn't study the Lenski experiment. It's because of things like that. But there's one other thing that is, I talked to microbiologist Andrew Fabich, and he introduced me to the idea of the pan-genome in bacteria. There's a lot of pressure for bacteria to dump genes. Only 20% of E. coli is conserved across all strains. 20%. Selection has a tremendous pressure to dump genes. Okay, so they can recover it because they may or may not be able to recover it because of horizontal gene transfer. But if we take this right,
or if a virus picked up part of the gene from one bacteria and deposited it into another one.
Exactly. So this trumps what I wanted to say is where I'm headed. This trumps the Lenski experiment if we're talking about organisms like, say, eukaryotes that may not have such easy facility for horizontal gene transfer, if any at all. Because if we're using bacteria as a model for what selection favors, it selects for a lot of reductive evolution. And
plus,
if this happens to eukaryotes, the net direction of evolution is not going to be accumulation and more complexity.
Yeah, it's hard to compare. I mean, a lot of it's apples and oranges because bacteria can hold multiple plasmids that they can acquire even from different species. You know, different species are capable of making that pilus that will, it's like a tube where they can exchange plasmid information. And so it's not quite the same. Obviously, in humans, you might have some viruses that pick up part of your genome and deposit somewhere else.
But what we are finding, the thing that surprised me, just by total accident, Emery Moyna and I were reading just doing some journal clubbing. We found out that the humans also have a pan-genome. And the reason that struck me is I said, okay, there are two options. Does anyone really believe that one of the subpopulations evolved new genes, or is this an indication that we had more genes and then some of the subpopulations have lost them? That's right. The more natural interpretation. And if we look at this whole pan-genome profile of the bacteria with E. coli only 20% conserved, this is showing strong selection pressure to dump genes. And as I said, they can recover it because of the plasmid, but for eukaryotic species like humans, it's like, forget it. So I think it's clear there's what Behe has tried to say in his book, Darwin Devolves. When we look at pan-genome profiles, we have empirical evidence that selection tends to favor devolution in the sense of reductive evolution, losing genes. So I don't even use the word information. You can just, the gene is an accepted unit of complexity. And so Dr. Dan is correct in saying, in questioning whether this leads to immediate, eventual extinction. And I'm just going to leave that open. Mm-hmm. And I've had some conversations with Dr. Sanford. He said, it gets kind of hard to decide whether it's internal or external, because when the creature's so weak, it's hard to say what actually killed him off. And when you're dealing with the almost impossible number of variabilities in the wild that can maintain some of those genes,
it's really difficult to try to replicate that in the lab. Like I said, you would have to do so many different cultures where you grew some of your culture with an amino acid broth that has all 20 amino acids, and then you do another broth where there's only 19 amino acids, or just the bare essential amino acids, and then put in some other exotic sources of fuel that you don't use much. I mean, even our cells, it's like normally we don't have to metabolize the galactose very much in lactose and milk sugar when we're weaned by age 2, unless you go on and drink milk from another species like cow's milk and get the lactose that way. So, there's something that you had for a short period of time and then never used very much again, but you can't necessarily get rid of it either, or your offspring would not be able to breastfeed and would be reliant on, they would get terrible diarrhea if they did, and that would be a disadvantage. But yeah, all these, I wonder how much of the genome is expressed at any one moment in time. And of course, that's also tissue specific. Like you'll probably, you definitely don't have genes turned on in certain tissues ever in that cell line once it's been differentiated from the stem cell. And so, could it be lost in somatic cells, or in, I guess in populations, the cells could lose it, but then get outcompeted in various environments. So there's so much at play in terms of the environment affecting the genetic expression and vice versa, not just the retention of genes, but the epigenetic, regulation of those genes.
I missed earlier just a little bit, Doctor. You mentioned something about someone passing away. I had a little audio problem.
That's fine. No, yeah, my aunt passed away. She was.
I want to express my condolences. I had some audio problem, and I said I better just I'd like to clarify that, and I wanted, if that were the case, I wanted to express my condolences. So.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
To you and your family.
All right. I'm
right,
tired. I'm going to listen in. I'll stick around just to see if they had, John or Tangela had any questions for me. Otherwise, I'll listen on my headphones when I go pick up my son.
Dr. Carter, quick question for you. And Sal, this will also probably entertain you. I actually watched part of the Aaron Raw wannabe Dave interaction yesterday, and he made the statement, and I'm quasi-paraphrasing, but he said that humans do not have the reverse transcriptase enzymes. And I'm pretty sure that's a utterly false position, but have I forgotten something?
He said humans do not have reverse transcriptase?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a viral specific enzyme for RNA viruses, because they need it to turn the RNA into DNA. So it's the transcription is going from DNA to RNA, and then the reverse of that, which requires the enzyme reverse transcriptase, would turn RNA from like an RNA genome into DNA that can be utilized by the host cell.
Right.
So as far as I know, we don't make the reverse transcriptase unless you're HIV infected.
Right, but I'm pretty sure I read a paper
I just Googled this.
on...
Telomerase is another reverse transcriptase found in eukaryotes, including humans.
Right,
Really?
and where I'm going with that is I've read papers on this specifically in relation to the I'm having a brain freeze here on I'm gonna have a brain fart. What's the term where you're taking something and moving it to a different location?
Translocation.
Transposon.
Transposons. There we go. Transposons. It's transcribed into RNA, moved, and then the reverse transcriptase process is utilized to put it back into a different position.
Interesting, because I was wondering, like, why would we be converting RNA back into DNA?
My point is that if that is true, then now I'm not suggesting the point this was being brought up in the interview with him was about, like, will the mRNA vaccines cause DNA modifications like that? I'm not going down that rabbit hole. But the point, I was like, I'm pretty darn sure I've read papers on this that actually is what's being executed in that whole process, which is happening, as we now know, all over the genome. Like it's a huge portion, especially in development, right? And anyway, so that was just a question I had, because I'm like, have I forgotten something here? Because I'm pretty sure I'd read that was the case.
That's cool. I got to look into that. I'd be interested if there's some sort of way of the reverse transcriptase in humans to be able to identify just our own RNA and distinguish it from foreign RNA, so it doesn't end up transcribing it from RNA back into DNA. Like, does it recognize any sort of chemical tags on there, or or can it do any source of RNA and turn it back into DNA?
Yeah, that part of it I don't know. And Dr. Dan, if you don't go down that rabbit hole, man, that was not what I was suggesting. I was just specifically talking about it in relation to the process being done in the human body. And because he went on this whole random, his expose, Wannabe Dave did, about how it's just impossible to be done. And it just doesn't happen, and people are just ignorant and all this other kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, I think this may be another one of those scenarios in relation to, like, Dr. Tour eviscerating him on abiogenesis, same kind of premise. Like, and part of the reason I'm thinking this is I Googled, it sounded like he was reading from a, like, CDC talking point memo, and I Googled it, and I found stuff in the CDC memo that stated that, reverse transcriptase doesn't happen in the human body. And just like, yeah, it does. Like, what's going on here? But again, like I said, I'm not doing this from an anti-vax. This is not about anti-vax or that. I'm not going down that topic.
Oh, is that what Dan is referring to?
I'm just talking about it from the actual process. But ultimately, if we got on one side of the equation about people being told that this doesn't happen, and then the other side, there's like all these papers that, there's multiple papers that I've read about this exact concept in relation to, like, embryo development, for example. Which one is true then? Like, we're anyway. I thought it was interesting.
Dan says telomerase carries with it its own RNA template. It just doesn't just grab random RNAs. Okay, so it can't work on every free floating RNA. It has to be a specific one, it looks like.
Yeah, well, there's two. There's a free one, and there's another one. There's one that has. I'm talking about in terms of, like, things we've observed that I've read about anyway. Some of them have all the parts, and then others need to do it themselves, right? And then others have to have external factors come in and do the process.
Got it. Yeah, if you have some papers on that, I'd like to see those. We need to have, like, a repository where we can. I'm sure each of us on our computer has our own database of papers. Are all nicely organized and stuff. But it'd be nice to have. Otangelo is really good about that, and having a big collection of papers and important points from the papers on his website. But it'd be nice to have some kind of cloud folder where we can just keep up to date on the literature and point out, hey, this is a cool article, check it out. And then I know some people, if you're not at a university, it's very difficult to get access to some of these publications as well. Otangelo, did you have any comments before I take off and gonna try to grab a bite to eat before I leave?
To be honest, Dr. Carter, I didn't understand much about the conversation. It is not really so much my field, so I'm honest about
No problem,
that.
yeah.
So I have not much to contribute to that.
Well, okay, I guess I'll take off then, and I'll be listening in. I always enjoy listening in on evidence and reasons. Sal's channel's typically pretty peaceful and dignified, and brings out some useful conversations. And I like learning, I like problem solving, and I'm trying to play catch up after 10 years of being super busy creating classes. And so it's nice to learn as I listen and multitask.
Yes.
In my busy day.
Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Carter. I had to step in and out as usual, I'm taking care of Mom, so I'm really
Oh,
glad
yeah, sure.
you all joined and can help me out. Otherwise, the stream would have to close. So, so thank you, and I hope you'll be able to hear a few things as you listen in. And we really do look forward to working with you. And God willing, we're going to get that conference going somehow.
Yeah, that'll be good. All right, you guys have a good day. I'll catch you later.
Yes. Okay, I got your email and I'll respond later to it. Okay.
Sounds good. All right.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye.
Have a good one, Dr. Carter.
LPP, I'm sorry I fell asleep last night. My schedule's been kind of crazy, so I don't know what happened for the rest of your hour.
Oh no, it was. I mean, the whole thing went basically how I anticipated. I mean, I got multiple. I'm getting massive amounts of entertainment right now over on Speed's channel. They're making cracks about the whole deal, which I find extraordinarily entertaining. I may actually do my first ever review of a Speed of Pudding stream, because the stuff coming out of their mouths I'm getting great amounts of entertainment out of it. But no, it overall went well. I mean, it basically boiled down to what I expected. Dr. Carter's in the side chat, so if he wants to counter this, he can do so. But basically, it boiled down to either he didn't know what I was talking about in relation to communication theory and its application to genetics, and basically it boiled down to, well, if it was a frozen accident, then I guess I'm going to go with that. Is basically where it.
Yeah, I listened a little bit to the stream yesterday night, John, and I thought really that Dan has no argument at all. He just sticks to the frozen accident claim, which is just a baseless claim. It isn't backed up by anything. Basically, it's just a made-up explanation. But I mean, why should there be such a frozen accident at all? It makes no sense. Why should molecules make such an arrangement of assigning meaning of a set of molecules to another one? Makes no sense at all.
So Dan is now saying, I said I disfavor the frozen accident hypothesis. I know you did. And that's why I kept grilling you on if the others were not considered plausible, where would you go? And you said then you would retreat back to a frozen accident hypothesis. So I then, after grilling you on that, one of the reasons I was reading large excerpts from those papers that I did was that there's been 30 years of experimentation which has debunked deterministic physics and chemistry being responsible for the value assignments of the codon to amino acid, which was the entire point that I was making throughout the entire thing. And therefore, it leaves you with nothing but a frozen accident to rely upon. So either you weren't paying attention, or you're just ignoring the entire point being made, just like everything else. Like, yes, all this logic applies 100% in any other context, except for nature, it doesn't apply. So, which Dan, now he's saying never say it was deterministic. If you're talking about stereochemical analysis things, those are literally deterministic. I mean, I don't know where else you want to go, man. You want to rely on probabilities in which there isn't probabilities. If there is no connection, the affinities aren't there. If there is no chemical reaction between them, you have nothing. I mean, anyway. Sorry, Otangelo, go ahead.
Well, they don't only use the excellent explanation in regards of the genetic code, but also, as you just mentioned right now, in regards of homochirality, and also in regards of the biofriendliness of the universe and fine-tuning. So all these things, basically, in order to cancel God and an intelligent creator, they just resort to a made-up explanation, which is a frozen accident. I mean, you can stick in whatever you want. if you don't like God, I mean, you can put in as much as a frozen accident, you can put in Santa Claus or 14 pixies or whatever you want. It makes in as much sense as a frozen accident. It's just a made-up explanation without evidence whatsoever.
Well, agreed. And the other piece of it too, and Sal, in the context of where you like to go, I made this point last night. I'm like, we're not talking about hypotheticals. We're talking about three-dimensional symbols that necessitate or have the necessity of a three-dimensional intermediary. Like, there is no way around this. And like, we all accept that this is the case, that we observe this as what is happening. And now you're going to get into, I mean, we got all the way to the point, and Sal, you might appreciate this. And Tangela, I don't know if you missed this part. It was rather interesting, I thought. Towards the end, we got into the evolutionary models relying on a more simple model to be able to account for all of this stuff. And I'm like, wait a minute. Per the literature that I already went through, we have a robust system now that doesn't have the capacity to execute all these different evolutionary algorithms that you guys are relying upon. So you're now stating that a more simplistic, less functionally robust system somehow solved the problem that the current one that has greater capacity can't. How does that make any sense? That makes no sense. I mean, in the analogy in the aftershow, the analogy I talked about was it's the equivalent of like you got a truck, got something stuck in the mud, and you bring your F-350 over to tug it out. You can't. It's not enough. It doesn't have enough torque. Then the guy in the motorcycle runs up and is like, "Oh man, I could totally pull that out with my motorcycle." And you're like, look at him like, hey, hang on. So you've got the truck with all the extra torque and the gigantic engine can't pull this thing out of the mud, but you think that your motorcycle can. Oh yeah, because it's way more flexible. Like, huh? Anyway.
I think the other breakthrough that's just not beyond theoretical, and what I think also really counts, the net direction of natural selection has been empirically and observationally established, at least as far as anything we've actually directly observed, to be loss of function. People say, oh, what do you mean by function? Okay, how about loss of genes? That's well accepted. Losing genes, losing organs. We don't see acquisition of organs as much as we see loss of them. And that should be troubling, that selection is selection for disabling of organs, if not outright loss, and also genes. That doesn't bode well, because if all the observations both in the present day, both in the lab and the field, are consistent with natural selection, selecting for simplicity rather than accumulation of complexity, that's really bad. And then in addition to that, you have the theoretical stuff that you were showing. So anyway, for some of you that caught this late, I was explaining why I haven't studied Lenski's experiment. I said, this is like straining at gnats and letting camels through. They talk about one little trivial gain of function. And it's like, what about all the disabled genes or compromised genes and promoters and regulatory systems? This is, I mean, if you gain one thing and then lose 15 functionalities, how is this going to support long-term evolution in terms of accumulation of complexity? And I pointed out to Dr. Carter, just surveying what we know with the phenomenon of pan-genomes, especially in bacteria, it's evident there's a lot of selection pressure to dump genes, not to acquire them, because only 20% of E. coli is conserved. So we have a lot of E. coli that don't have genes that other E. coli have. So, I know the creationists focus a lot on Lenski's experiment, but I talked to some microbiologists, and that kind of sparked my interest. Just look at the pan-genomes. And we could also look at it for eukaryotes. And then Emery and I saw something with humans having a pan-genome. And I said, okay, why is it that some humans have genes that others don't? you can either suppose that those humans, that subpopulation evolved them new, which is very unlikely, or we had some common ancestor that had all these genes and then the subpopulations lost them. Emery, welcome.
Hey, Sal. Glad I could make it.
What's up, Emery?
Yeah, I don't want to be taking you away from your homework, man. Hey, you know what? Both of us have been playing hooky. I have some deadlines I should be working on, but I had so much fun with Dr. Tour stuff.
Yeah.
I just postponed.
I hear you. Like, yeah. Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, and Sal, to your point that you were making there, did you hear the part I was talking about last night in terms of the triplet of triplets?
No, I just zonked out. I woke up later at 2 a.m. in the morning.
Okay. So one of the papers I was referring to is the case for the triplet of triplets, and they now have empirical evidence that and this goes back to pragmatics, but the codons the interpretation of the codons is influenced by the two codons to the left and to the right of it. Whoa. And that it modifies the folds. That those, like swapping things out, even if they're synonymous, can modify the folds, not the codon being read, the codons next to it. So you have an influence of 5 codons being in play, and like basically their summary was, what kind of macro ramifications can this have in relation to us being able to figure out human disease? Like, we're so hyper focused on individual modifications when we actually need to be looking at a much broader scheme, and that's just inside of one gene sequence, and then that's before you even account for how different genes influence each other in terms of what the end expression is. We're talking about even before transcription. And anyway, I think all this just kind of lends itself to the fact that we honestly, the more we learn, the more we don't know, or the realization of what we don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of biology as a whole. The more we learn, the more we realize, I'm not sure about that.
And it's at every level of biology, organismal all the way down to the molecular and atomic. And I was just reflecting. When I was in junior high in 1975, they were teaching me the Urey-Miller experiment. And yeah, I know that was a long time ago. And I've had the privilege of watching this train wreck just develop, where they say we're so close to solving it, or they pretend that they've solved it, and the train wreck just gets worse, and it's covered up with self-delusion, probably borderline fraud, if not outright fraud, to perpetuate this. It's just, what we know now, it's the design argument has moved forward like I've never seen it, and I expect that trend to continue. Briefly, I have to take a little break, so gentlemen, carry on. I will monitor the channel, and if people want to share their screen, I just might be a little delayed in getting to it, but I'll try to help with that.
Awesome. So, let's interject real quick on this. So, on the point that's being made I think this sums it up pretty well. Genetic algorithms do not scale well with complexity. That is, where the number of elements which are exposed to mutation is large, there is often an exponential increase in search space size. This makes it extremely difficult to use the technique on problems such as designing an engine, a house, or plane. In order to make such problems tractable to evolutionary search, they must be broken down into the simplest representation possible. Hence, we typically see evolutionary algorithms encoding designs for fan blades instead of engines, building shapes instead of detailed construction plans, and airfoils instead of whole aircraft designs. The second problem of complexity is the issue of how to protect parts that have evolved to represent good solutions from further destructive mutation, particularly when their fitness assessment requires them to combine well with other parts. I don't know how much more of a stark assessment of where things stand with evolutionary theory than that direct statement. That's from a 2018 paper review article. And They go in, and that's just one example. I mean, that whole paper was just an utter evisceration of all this stuff, and basically like, yeah, we have all these random things that supposedly work in theory, but when we actually go out and do the real simulation of it, or attempt to pull this off in simulations, it doesn't actually work. We're not seeing, we're seeing, we might see some adaptation on the micro level, but nothing even remotely close to the macro level advancements that Darwinism requires. And yet it's continued to be told that, oh, well, you know, it was a more simple thing in the past. It's like, so the evidence is directly the reciprocal of what your claim is, and your entire claim is founded upon. How does this make sense?
It doesn't, but that's the point to a certain extent. Like, sometimes it's easier for people to mix a tiny bit of truth in with the lie than it is to actually try and correct the lie.
Yeah, we see that all the time, that people, they simply swallow what science papers say. They don't think really if what the authors say makes sense, but because it comes from a peer-reviewed science paper, so then it must be true. And I mean, this happened to me just recently at Speed's channel, where I brought up a science paper from 2008 of Royal Society in regards of sequence space of proteins. And the abstract was providing a number of the possible sequence of a protein with 100 amino acids. And I said, listen, you have for a sequence of 100 amino acids 1 to 10 to the 130th power of possible sequences. And that's in the realm of the impossible for just a small protein. And then they went to read the conclusion of the paper. And they tried to make a case to give support to materialistic causes. And then they said, oh, you didn't read your paper, and they made a big thing out of it. And John Peterson even made a stream just about that at his stream. And that's how you see that these people, they do not scrutinize what these papers in the end say, because there is a circle around the scientific data. And that philosophical circle is always interpreted in order to favor a materialistic explanation. And these guys, they don't get that. And I said to Speed, well, that's not your last word. And I investigated this a little bit further. I made a small response presentation. I did publish it later today at my channel. And it is very interesting that in my investigation, I looked a little bit deeper into Pelagibacter oblique, which is known to be the smallest bacteria on Earth, with about 1.3 million nucleotides. Now, what is interesting is that it is said to be coming from a more complex bacteria with more genes, or basically it evolved. And it showed up in the evolutionary timeline about 1.9 billion years ago. Now, interesting is that the oldest bacteria are claimed to be Cyanobacteria, which emerged about 3.5 billion years ago. So I went to figure out what actually the simplest Cyanobacteria is. And interesting is that the smallest one has about 3.2 million nucleotides. Compared to 1.3 of Pelagibacter, it's much bigger and it's much more complex. And that contradicts basically the evolutionary story, because we should expect that things are going from more simple to more complex. And that's not what we see, actually, if we stick to the data of these papers. You start with a bacteria which is very complex. I mean, cyanobacteria, they have nitrogenase, they fix nitrogen, and they make photosynthesis and have circadian clocks and so forth. They're very, very complex organisms. And they are claimed to emerge at the earliest stage of the history of life. So that's a paradox. They can't explain that. Now, if you take that bacteria and make the calculation, let's suppose that that would really be the first life form, a genome with 3.2 million nucleotides requires the odds of 1 to 10 to 1.25 million power. And that's absolutely out of anything which would be reasonable to believe that that could be possible to emerge randomly or by natural means. So, I mean, if they want to be honest, they have to deal with this data. And I mean, the only explanation, in my understanding, is that this points to design.
Well, at this point, Notangelo, they can't even get 20 nucleotides to bond. So the premise of millions is just not even remotely plausible. Even if they do somehow figure out how all of them to build themselves, I mean, it's just, you can't even get the binding to happen. Like
neither in nucleotides nor in amino acids.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Like they can't even get the peptide bonds to form in any length. They can't get the nucleotides to bond in any length without external factors. And then it's like, so but the million or the 1.3 million for this, simplest form doesn't require. I mean, it don't have to happen all at once. And it's like, cool. You can't even get 20 to bond. What's your point? Like, I don't really understand where you're coming from on this. It's like we have to have all these insights. Like, last night, I don't know if you guys heard this, but there was a whole piece where Dan and I were going back and forth, and he was trying to explain how it got more complex through methylation. And I'm like, okay, well, how did that requires enzymes, right? Well, yeah.
I was thinking, what is this guy talking about? That makes no sense. What does it have to do with the genetic code at all?
Well, I agree with you, but I mean, the point to him, I'm like, so you're saying that your explanation is something that requires enzymes, but you have to have the sequence of the enzyme from this code that hasn't yet have the functionality to do the advancement in the code? Like, what? I don't understand. Like, how does this? I'm sitting there listening to him. Like, I kept asking him more questions, trying to figure out, like, am I missing something here? Because this sounds completely ridiculous. And then trying to bounce over to ribozymes and stuff, and I'm like, how does that account for? So you're saying that, like, there was like ribozymes that were doing the methylation? Like, is that what we're talking about? It was very strange. But Emery, I know you probably don't have tons of time with all your grad school work. Do you think any things you were wanting to talk about?
Honestly, like this week is probably the easiest week I will have of the entire year, or close to it, because one class this is basically a writing week this week. So all I have to do is work on a paper, which no biggie. The other classes, like, they're nothing too major. So I'm okay for the moment. Although I think at some point when Sal gets back, we need to brainstorm on the idea that Dr. Carter brought up, because I think that's a really good suggestion of having some kind of repository. And Jamie's been posting about this in the private chat, but I think we need to get some kind of repository for papers, because, I mean, realistically, John, you've got a bunch of papers. You've got that Google Drive, I know, but Tangelo's got a bunch of papers. He's got them on his website. I've got tons of papers bookmarked, but I don't have them posted anywhere. I'm sure Sal's got tons of papers. It'd be nice to have them all in one place where we could just pull from them if we needed something for a conversation topic. So
I agree with that. That's something I've thought about that too. I mean, it's we're having an open access. At the end of the day, I mean, it's going to have to be somebody's going to have to be the admin. Like other people can have access, obviously, but I mean, have to have admin, right? Super admin. A sidebar on that. Sidebar. So you know how Evos love everything to be like archived and nested and have all the hierarchies? In every single one of those scenarios, in every other context, there's always a super admin.
Yeah.
There's always the super admin. Fascinating. So they in the evolutionary worldview, we're gonna like do a complete script flip and no super admin. Interesting, but yeah, I agree with you. That would be very very beneficial because a lot of times there's stuff that like I know of Otangelo's, for example, like different papers you've gone over. I'm like, oh, I've got that one, you know, and then there's other ones that are like, I wonder if I've seen that one, but I never downloaded, you know, that kind of thing. And because I think the other thing, having that destination spot would give people incentive. So like myself, very often I'll search on my phone, find something, and I've got everything like preset. If I download a PDF, I've got my general folder preset to be the main one that opens when I open up my drive.
Right.
And I can just be like, oh, subfolder, tap. And then it's ready to upload immediately. And I don't, it's helped me to not just read something online and then not keep access to it. Because at some point you forget. I mean, I can archive a lot of stuff in my mind, but eventually it's like, what was the keyword query I did to find this paper? And you start to lose track of them.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to bookmark papers when I find papers I want, but even still, like, you know, let's just put it this way. I've got like 6 or 7 different folders of bookmarked stuff. There's no way I'm going to find something if I want it. So, yeah, so it'd be helpful to have something like that, and it'd be good to. So
I don't know about y'all. Very often, I'll have like a semi-mental image of a paper too, like what the initial header looked like, you know, in the abstract, and I'll be like, So sometimes I'll kind of open them up the thumbnail view in my folder and like scroll through and be like, I think it was this one, you know, and then go look through it if I've forgotten which paper had a particular topic in it.
Yeah, but that is helpful. But so something that we probably should be thinking about at some point. I mean, it doesn't have to be this every day, but at some point that'd be a useful thing to have. And I mean, I'm sure Standing and his crew would be more than happy to jump on that too, because I mean they've got papers out their ears, but you know, not necessarily easily accessible.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I tell you the thing that I find very interesting about, and I think this goes back to the hyperspecificity of the professional disciplines, and like because things are so complicated now, the professionals, right, are usually so focused on their little niche. They might be reading tons of papers on their niche, but are in no way, shape, form, or fashion reading things from cross discipline or discipline might be cross focus, I guess, or specialty. And the reason I say that, I find it very interesting listening to some of these lectures, even watching lectures from different sources, and I'm like, I'll hear them say something, and I'm like, I know I read a paper that directly contradicts that position or dramatically supports it, but it's obvious from the way they're talking, they don't know that question's already been answered. Or, it's like, well, hypothetically, this might be X, Y, and Z. I'm like, man, I know I read a paper on that. And I really wonder how much the lack of crosstalk is slowing the overall development of knowledge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I know I think that's probably true as a general statement. Like, although there are exceptions. Like I think there are people who go to other disciplines and they say, hey, I want person X because I think they'll be helpful in this X field. And Sal talks about this a little bit when they bring in programmers to talk about like various genetics issues and so on. But there is a significant lack of cross-disciplinary discussion. Most people tend to get isolated down their own little rabbit holes and then never really interact with what's going on in the big picture. They just get focused on the tiny little section of the tiny little section of the tiny little section of biology that they're studying. So there is quite a bit of that. And I think that that's something that probably most even evolutionary researchers would agree with, that most people are hyper specialized because they have to be. There's just so much out there. You can't possibly get all of it. So,
no, I would agree with you on that. I think it's, and maybe where I'm coming from is more on the, I don't want to say more on, but in line with the understanding of the fundamentals. So like as I've gotten involved in all this stuff, I have forced myself to go and learn the in some cases relearn, in other cases learn for the first time some of the like root fundamentals.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wonder if our education system is such that, oh yeah, they took that undergrad class on that one. Therefore, checkbox has been accounted for.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Therefore, they must know how the application, or have some kind of understanding of the application of those principles on their specialty. And it's like, yeah, so I'm just going to go out on a limb and be like, classes freshman and sophomore year, you probably were just trying to pass. I'm just saying. That's just a fact with like the vast majority of people. And we now it's well documented now that people are like cramming and dumping the information.
Yeah.
And that's happening at all levels of academia, not just undergrad, right?
Yep.
And if that is the case, which we know it is, it's studied, this is true, we know this, then how are we actually expecting all of this supposed validity in this context, like of consensus, right? Like, so we have consensus on this, but you don't actually know, but because you have XYZ credential, therefore we should just bow and scrape to the consensus? Come on now. This seems weird to me.
This is the advantage that we have because they're so I think people have a misapprehension that there is like a greater consensus or understanding than there is because there's so much information, and it's when you're the minority or whatever to the rest of the world in a subject and always being mocked or whatever, you recognize that, but the other side doesn't seem to.
I mean, that's unfortunately true. I mean, I was chatting with Erica last night during I think it was John's stream, and she appealed a couple of times to consensus. And Erica, if you listen to this, I'm not ripping you. I understand where you're coming from, but consensus isn't science. I'm sorry, consensus is not science. It's just not. And unfortunately, because people don't have a fundamental understanding of how basic principles interact with fields, we have people out there who just will repeat whatever the consensus is without thinking critically about it. And this goes back to a point I harp on sometimes on my channel where I talk about people just not thinking critically. And I think part of that is the education system. I think part of it is people just don't want to think critically because they don't want to know what the outcome of them thinking critically will be. And just as a case in point, and again, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but in Canada, if they'd opened schools in the province of Ontario, and if a child in a class tested positive for coronavirus, he, of course, he or she had to go quarantine, but then every other student in the class, including those asymptomatic, had to quarantine in a room in the house by themselves with no interaction from anyone else for 14 days. They're doing this for kindergartners. And there were parents who were openly on Twitter admitting they were going to follow those guidelines. There's your lack of critical thinking.
That's almost mistreatment of a child. I mean, I tell you the thing that I'm most concerned about in relation. Well, not most concerned about. One of the things I'm very concerned about in relation to all of this kind of madness that's being talked. Those protocols make no sense whatsoever from a macro view. But more importantly, given what we know about the developmental stages of these kids, and like these kids are in,
Mm-hmm.
and the well-documented, well-studied ramifications of the removal of the interactions, all these kind of things that have on them intellectually, psychologically, and emotionally. It's well known what happens, and many of the long-tail ramifications. And yet it's being put forth and almost, and in some cases, required by edict. Mm-hmm. And potential enforcement and ramifications for the parents, both from a legal and a societal perspective. And I'm just like, okay, we know, for case in point, it's well documented that between 0 and 5, the amount of physical interaction and touching educational component, like game playing and stuff like that with kids, impacts their IQ by anywhere from 7 to 12 points. Like, this is well known. It's well documented. There's paper after paper on this topic, and it's one of the recognized negatives, or sorry, not saying negative, but an advantage of having between 0 and 5 the mother and child versus putting the kid in daycare, for example. Documented benefits. Then you're getting a little bit further. You get change next stage of cognitive development. Having the societal interactions and direct application of things that they're learning from a spatiotemporal standpoint, the 3-dimensional versus the 2-dimensional, right? We also know that directly impacts the development of that portion of the brain. So, like, for case in point, there's been multiple studies on, like, the impact of chess on kids. And they've been able to document that it actually, one of the many things that it actually modifies in their brain from a beneficial perspective is their 3D, like, ability to interact with things from a 3D imaging perspective. And enables them to it actually impacts the creative side of their brain, which I think is amazing, right? But in the context of what we're doing, yeah, well, it was one of the things I researched after. One of the things I researched after my brain surgery, I found out, I was like, "Oh, that's going to be fascinating." Anyway,
that's awesome.
My point is that I'm just using chess as an example. The same type of principles apply in other arenas, right? And if they're not having that same 3-dimensional interaction with their peers, and I don't necessarily mean from having to be at school. School, like, going to school is not relevant. I mean letting them actually get out and do things and learn from a actual real world perspective versus the hypothetical. And I think we're setting ourselves up for serious issues with kids as they get older, just from this. Because now we're talking about over a year. We're over a year at this point, right? Where the kids' developmental stages have been completely flipped upside down. And if this goes on much longer, we're talking about a kid that was 5 is now 7. 7 is now 9. I mean, think about that. I mean, this is a big deal. Enough of my tangent.
Yeah, economic too.
Yeah, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much. My goal was just to point out people are not critically thinking. Like, in order to just putting a child in a room by themselves for 2 weeks to quarantine, no, you're not thinking. You're not critically thinking. You're just doing whatever it is you're told. And I'm sorry, there's a lot of that goes on, not necessarily to that extreme, but that goes on in the realm of science too, where you just do what you're told and don't actually critically examine and the papers and the data. Like, what I see a lot of times is the evolutionary biologist or whatever will say, well, they'll read the conclusion of the paper and they'll say, well, the paper says this. Well, yeah, of course the authors come to that conclusion. Does their data support that? And there's just not enough of that where people will sit back and evaluate what the data actually says versus what the authors say in their conclusion. And when I first started reading papers, I would just read the discussion section because I was, I didn't really have the background at the time to actually understand what was going on. So I just kind of skipped over all the data stuff. But now that as I've gotten more into it, I've started realizing you need to make sure that what their data backs up their conclusions, because you can say anything you want in the conclusion section, but what matters is, does your data actually warrant you saying that? And a lot of times it doesn't. Like, I remember there was a paper, and I cannot for the life, and this is again why we need a paper repository. There was a paper that was on a human ape fossil, supposedly, and they spent the entire paper basically saying ape-like, 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 ape-like over and over and over again. And then when they got to the conclusion section of the paper, they said, "So we believe that this fossil is human." Case in point, like that they just don't. A lot of times they do not. It doesn't always match up with the way things are actually going on. So.
You're right. I mean, and it's to me, it's very disconcerting of, what is actually being studied like, what is actually are we actually learning anything? And I don't mean like across the board. I mean just in a lot of these cases, right? Like, is our macro understanding actually expanding, or are we artificially creating a narrative? And I think it's probably somewhere in between the two. It's some kind of a hybrid of those two extremes. But in relation to how it's being applied to, the development of humanity in general, I think it's very troubling. And I think I think what we see in terms of this little microcosm of YouTube that we engage in is kind of a case in point of the macro ramifications of this stuff. Like, we have, all of us deal on a regular basis with folks that it doesn't matter how many ways that you can completely annihilate their talking point. They continue to double, triple, quadruple, quintuple down on the talking point. Even if you can quote a paper from somebody who also thinks like them that, hey, X talking point is false, they still double down on that talking point. It's like, okay, we've now reached the narrative having gained, being cemented into the societal mind versus the actual reality. And that, I think, is a very, very troubling component of where things stand currently.
Can I just say one thing before I go here?
Yeah.
If Dr. Carter's listening, look for my email. And I just want to encourage everybody to guard yourself. And I'm talking to myself too, but just guard yourself to not be a yes man, like, especially when talking to other people that we agree with or whatever. Because that's, I think that's a bad way to go. Like, we should be willing to challenge each other, even though you feel beaten or whatever by the secularists or whatever, however you want to look at it, the atheists. Don't find yourself always just agreeing with everybody, let's not be like how the problems you're talking about. But have a good day.
Have a good one, Jamie. Take care, man.
Well said. Agree with you completely.
Yeah, I completely agree with what he said. We need to be thinking critically about every issue. Not, just because I say it or John says it and you happen to agree with me or John on the top. Don't just take our word for it. Like, go look it up. Go research it on your own. Go research the stuff that Standing says. Go research the stuff that Sal says. Look it up. Research it. Research the things that the leading atheists say. Find out what the truth actually is. We're not here to just tell you accept anything we say. We actually want you to engage your brain and research it yourself.
I agree 100%. It's one of the reasons I make the joke on a regular basis about the whole "let me Google that for you" tool. Of in the modern era in which we live, there's no reason for you to not go see if you can debunk my claim. It takes no time at all if you will go and do it. And what I find very interesting, and this applies on both sides, but especially applies on the atheist side, there's been multiple occasions, myself and I've seen other people do this, go look it up. Go use Google. Use Google it. Google it right now. Google it. And they're like, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, you're okay, so you're claiming that I'm full of it, or that whatever I'm saying is 100% false. Google it then. Right now. Because reason usually when I'm making that point is either I have just done so, or I have done so in the past, and I know what's going to come up if they go and Google the search query. It's going to support my position. And it's I think a lot of times I'm sure this applies on both sides, but I think a lot of times in the atheist community, if I Google this, I may actually have to defend my claim, and I don't want to accept any burden of proof.
I think there's certainly possibly some of that, but you're right, though. I do think it applies. It does cut both ways. There's look in every movement there's always going to be a few people who are just intractable and are going to cause issues, and they're just every movement that has existed throughout history has had its troublemakers, right? There's always a few people where, what are you doing here? We don't kind of like to get rid of you. Can you go away? But so that's why I always try to encourage people to look stuff up. When I write stuff for the blog, I try to make sure that I include sourcing so that people can easily look something up. Now, I obviously can't always do that for YouTube because, if you're citing papers on YouTube, it's a little harder to get them all in there, but because you're, speaking verbally. But I try to provide sourcing, or at least a place where you can look to start sourcing, because I want people to examine things. I want people to think. I want people to look things up and see what's real and what's not.
Yeah, it's with the access to information that we currently have, there's no excuse.
Right.
It's guess what I'm saying is it's part of the reason one of my favorite sayings, and what I have at the end of a lot of my streams, is the difference between confidence and arrogance is being able to back up your BS. And in the modern era, with the almost instant access to information that we have, you have no excuse to not be able to back up your BS. And it's kind of to boil it down, like, either take the time to go and find the support of your argument, or don't use the argument. And in what really gets me, and this applies to like just education in general, what really gets me fired up by a lot of this stuff in terms of public debate and just societal issues that we're facing right now is, there's so much argument and propaganda put forth that unless we hear this on YouTube all the time, right? Unless you are PhD, you cannot have an opinion. Or unless you are insert, whatever credential, therefore you cannot have any understanding of X.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm like, so the only rewind, and I think this kind of goes down to like the paradigm shifts that have happened, and what I'm finding very interesting in like these YouTube interactions is people who theoretically, just like myself, have grown up, and you, Emery, have grown up with access to information. They book two things. Number one, they have no idea, no real world experience of how it was before this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like for myself, like I'm 36. I remember in my when I was like 10, 11, 12, really up until, really even up to like 2008 when the smartphone came into play. But the internet was not anywhere close to what it is now.
No.
And there were still a lot of things, informational wise, that you did have to get from the university library, right? Or the university archives and those giant textbooks and stuff. Like that's where the information was housed.
Yep. I remember when I was a kid, we made plenty of trips to the local university library.
Right. So then, and obviously any time prior to that in history, right, the only places that had that information were the ones that had the physical books.
Yep.
That is no longer the case. So where did the credibility factor and the supposed, this is the education, the expert, therefore I should bow and scrape and rely upon their consensus and such, stem from? It was because nobody else had access to the information. It was either in the mind, literally in the mind of the individual in question, or in the book or books from which he implanted it into his mind, right? Or it was a direct transfer of mind to mind. That's not how the real world is now. And if we have the access to the exact same information that would be taught in a class, and we can watch lectures from the class that the same person would have gone to, or another individual would have gone to, who now has that quote-unquote degree or whatever, that expertise. So I'll make the argument that you cannot have a level of understanding of, at a minimum, to be able to have the conversation, and if not, be able to have like real, not just understanding, but like be able to postulate your own theorem, is to state that either the person making that argument either doesn't have the IQ points necessary to be able to do this for themselves, or they are consciously refusing to do so, and therefore projecting their refusal to go learn for themselves onto anybody who has. And that's what I find very disconcerting about what we're observing in the microcosm here on YouTube, because that seems to be like a very common.
It's generally something along the lines of, you're not qualified because you don't have X degree.
But you know what? Yeah. I'm living proof of that. I got hired. I don't have a PhD, but someone felt I had a sufficient brain and the correct kind of training. And we falsified a 35-year-old thing that was accepted by Ken Miller and Dennis Venema and so many others, this nylon-eating bacteria, and had been hanging around, and even science journals sometimes quote it, but we falsified it. Editors have told us, both privately and publicly, we falsified it. And I was like, Okay, so we have an entire cottage industry of evolutionary biology. Why didn't anyone correct it? And the answer is, well, they don't want to highlight all their mistakes, and this was a really embarrassing one. So the editors will say, "Hey, you're right, but go to another journal."
Well, and what's ironic about that is the extrapolation, kind of the point that I was making, Emery and I have been talking about, of the talking points being spewed, and that those narratives have been so deeply ingrained. I mean, how many debates, online, offline, have any one of us have had, where one of the talking points is, oh, evolution proven, nylon eating bacteria. Nylon didn't exist, therefore evolution is true. Right? And it's like, so did you not pay attention to the point you were just making, Sal? Like, are you unaware of it? Okay, now you are aware of it. Does it change your position? No. And vast majority of them does not change their position. Same thing with the Lenski experiments. They don't prove evolution. They actually act against it. Fast forward to now, right? And is it still used as a massive talking point? Absolutely. I mean, David Neff is a prime example of this. In one of his actually multiple debates, he has used the Lenski experiment supposedly in favor of evolution. When I called him out on it in a live stream and said, "Did you after the Jackson Wheat debate with I forget who the PhD was." Anyway, it'll come to me.
Kevin Anderson.
Kevin Anderson. When Dr. Anderson made him.
I heard.
When Dr. Anderson, when Jackson Wheat doubled down and I want to see the paper, they pulled it up, and it 100% supported the position taken by Dr. Anderson. Jackson conceded that it did, and completely annihilated all the previous talking points about the Lenski experiment. Fast forward to the after show, David Neff is doubling down on it. I was like, have you ever read the paper? No. Okay, you should. Fast forward 3 or 4 weeks, another after show, he's making the same talking point about the Lenski experiment. I come down there, call him out, hey, did you go read the paper? No, I didn't. So I told you what it said. You watched the debate with Jackson and Dr. Anderson. I called you out on it. You said you would. You didn't. And then you're now using the same talking point. So you're obviously not even attempting to go and do the point that Emery was making, which was go and research for yourself and find out if the claims being made are true, false, or unknown.
Yeah. And I couldn't live with myself just repeating talking points. That's just mindless repetition. Someone in the chat was One Cow Stampede. He was asking about the pan-genome. And let me see. He asked, do I have any links? There are actually many papers on the pan-genome, and this one is only with 55 strains of E. coli. They're probably, I'm just guessing, hundreds, if not thousands. And so the proportion that is core, what I might say is conserved, is probably a lot smaller than all the entire genome. Now, my point with all this is there's a lot of pressure for the E. coli not to hold genes it's not using immediately. So even if something might be useful in the future, if it's not immediately useful now, it's either not going to incorporate it through horizontal gene transfer, or it's going to get rid of it. So how does this relate to Lenski's experiment and evolution? This is one reason I really just don't pay attention to Lenski's experiment. You can imagine then that if instead of just dumping genes, they could be disabled somehow by mutation or whatever, it's just going to dump them because it's metabolically expensive to be expressing a protein. You have to synthesize chemicals, and then you have to put the proteins together and then do all sorts of other things. If it's cheaper to say, and I believe they've done this on some, and we have examples particularly in aircraft, where they wanted to make the aircraft lighter. So they dump parts of the aircraft, and it can fly at higher altitudes, but it's lost capabilities in order to do that. And so there's a lot of pressure for immediate disposal of genes. And my point is, if fitness increase is accomplished by disposing of complexity, if that's the net direction of evolution, how does this accumulate? How do you build by destroying and getting rid of stuff? I mean, come on, guys. And that's why I've ignored I've not ignored it, but it's just like Lenski's experiment is a small blip on my radar personally. I mean, I am very grateful for Dr. Carter and Dr. Michael Behe for exploring this question, just to kind of demystify what was going on. And Dr. Dan actually did a very good job of framing it in a way that looks favorable to evolution. He's talking about it in terms of evolutionary fitness. It proved that evolutionary fitness can still go up. And I'm like, this is just totally. I mean, I commend him for that. I'm not saying I agree with it, but he put up the best defense he could.
Well, so I mean, he's a good nebulous talker, but in one of the interactions I had with him, he didn't even know that the citrate thing was the result of the damage to, or the mutant damage to the on-off switch. I mean, he went on a whole tangent about how no, that was new functionality and all this kind of stuff. No. It was the removal of the off switch, the on-off switch. So it was now stuck in perpetual on position. So if that is the case, then how is that? That's like hardwiring the switch, the wires in your light switch, like taking off the cover, removing the freaking button, and being like, I'm going to connect everything so the circuit's now connected, therefore light is always on. And then being like, that's evolution. Like, no, that is not. Not in terms of like any beneficial deal. You've just plugged a function that already existed in the on position. It had been flipped off. What's your point? And I don't know, I have a hard time when people take those positions to give much validity to their other arguments if they're going to take such strong arguments or make such strong arguments to supposedly support their position when it literally contradicts their entire argument.
Now, I'm going to just pounce on this comment by Emo.
If you didn't, I would have.
I'm sorry?
I said if you didn't, I would.
First off, Emo has publicly said some derogatory things about me, so even though I try to remain civil, every now and then I may bend the rule here. This is an example of not looking at what the implication of what I was trying to say. I was trying to point out if the general thing that selection selects for is loss of genes, if that's on net average, and we've seen that both experimentally and observationally and theoretically, how does this accumulate? Complexity. That's the real problem of evolution. You're not answering the problem. It's like, do you not get it? That's a rhetorical question. I obviously have my opinion of whether you get it or not. Emery, have at it.
So this also gets into the whole relative fitness thing. Like, yeah, okay, maybe a gene loss can have a local relative increase to fitness, but it doesn't explain how you got atop that fitness peak to start with. All it explains is why you're rolling downhill. It does not explain how the rock got up there in the first place. And this is why this whole fitness landscape, adaptive fitness, and all this other garbage that's spewed out of the evolutionary biology community about fitness is utter garbage. It's garbage because you can have relative changes in fitness. Okay, fine. But it doesn't explain how you got there in the first place. And it doesn't explain why you're going downhill 99% of the time, if not higher than that.
If I may point something out, Erica asked, why are you going to absolute fitness? And that was actually a good question. Mm-hmm. I said, one of the problems, she said, why don't you use standard fitness? Okay, so by standard, I presume relative. It actually was a good question. I'm glad you brought it.
No, that's a legitimate question.
It's a legitimate question. the way you calculate, I have to get a little bit into the math of this. The way you calculate relative fitness, customarily, you'll take the most fit allele or trait, and that's the gold standard. And everything else is relative to that. So you'll say, okay, these guys just are not reproducing as fast. So relative fitness is relative. Okay, so absolute fitness is just how many offspring you have. There's some subtleties to this, and some of my papers described it. Absolute fitness is fertility times viability. And so basically, we have variations with haploid and diploid models, et cetera. Okay, I'm just simplifying this. So if an organism, if let's say one individual has one trait on average has say 10 kids, and the other trait in that same gene locus has only 8, then you just say, okay, we can assign the guy that has 10 kids as having relative fitness of 1 and the other guy 0.8, or you could do all sorts of other things. And Erica said, why are you using absolute fitness? I said, well, if the species is extinct, absolute fitness is 0. You're going to get a divide by 0 error. It's just not going to work. I mean, did they ever put that in their model? No. So she asked legitimately why I'm using absolute fitness. The other thing is, if the best guy in the class is declining and everything's on a curve, your relative fitness isn't going to be reflecting the overall decline of the whole species, so to speak. I mean, there are just lots of problems like this that people began to just like realize. It's like, oh my goodness, this is kind of like a vacuous. It's one of these theories that are empty. It just looks theatrically like they have substance, but there's no substance there because it doesn't. I'm like, if you keep, what they might say, renormalizing to the best of the worst. To the best of whatever you've got, you could actually have just total loss of complexity in your species. And it's like, oh, good, look at the relative fitness. We're still increasing. I'm just like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah. Let me give an analogy here that is away from biology that will hopefully make sense to people on a level that everybody, even non-biologists, will get. Imagine that you have a class full of students, and it's a really, really tough class for whatever reason. And so the professor decides he's going to grade on a curve. Does a person who gets a 59 on a test, is he quote unquote fit? Well, it depends. Is he the lowest score in the class or the highest score in the class? Because if everybody else got 30s, he's a good student. If everybody else got 75s, he's a terrible student. So, and that's relative fitness for you right there in a nutshell. It all depends on what's going on around you, whether you're fit or not fit.
And Erica made that point. He said it doesn't have anything with context. And I said, okay, that's one of the problems then, is if you're defining fitness it's contextually dependent in that sense. How are you going to be talking about things like absolute gain of complexity? We might call that in terms of the complexity of genes and interactions, et cetera. And I think some of these evolutionists and the evolutionary biologists are so steeped in circular reasoning and vacuous reasoning, they don't even see it. So, outsiders look at it and they're just like, oh my goodness, this is horrible.
Yeah, but the point you made a very good point right there. I mean, the fact they try to downplay and like dismiss the complexity component to all of this in terms of the fitness requirement for it, like there in no other scenario would that be remotely plausible. Like in any other context, you would be considered a complete and utter idiot to make the argument that somehow that's going to happen. And it kind of goes back, and I love this. I still haven't gotten over the fact that this actually happened. But my debate with Ron Garrett, when I asked him the direct question, do you actually think it is plausible that a piece of iron could turn itself into a sword? And he said, yes. And I'm like, how? He's like, well, I could come up with a hypothetical for that. Like a model for that. And I'm like, all of the steps that are required for the sword to just be formed out of a piece of iron. You actually think this. And he doubled down on it again.
And it's
And I'm
actually
like-
harder than that because you don't have to form the sword from a piece of iron. You have to get the piece of iron, which you have to get from iron ore, which you have to mine from rocks. So
Right.
it's actually even harder than that.
Well, of course it is, right? And I'm just like, if you just kind of, to dumb it down, like, you have a piece of steel, that's it. Is it ever going to turn itself into a sword? And if you're going to say yes, that that's actually plausible, then I'm going to come up with some scenario where that can happen. If that's your position you're going to take, I'm just using it as an example, right? Because I think in reality, it's actually more like, in terms of like biology, the sword looks simple compared to what we're talking about in biology, right? Like, do you think a transistor is going to form itself?
Yeah.
And that's where we're at now. Like, do you think all the circuits are going to form this? Here's the thing, and Sal, I know that you appreciate this a lot in terms of your background in electrical engineering and aerospace. I've talked about this before in terms of like the schematics of different things that you guys worked on and designed and all the engineering things. It's like when you look at the circuitry that's happening inside of organisms, it makes the most advanced stuff that we come up with look like child's play. And it's just like, we have a community. It's like, this is not like hypothetical. This is real. This is literal comparison. And you're looking at the circuitry that's happening in the organism, circuitry in a piece of, technology. The exact same logic is required. The types of circuitry, the different components are the same. They're organically made versus, out of something that humans have designed. But all the principles are the same. And it's like, would this ever create itself? Yes or no? And then again, to the point you made on the circular reasoning, like if they're going to say, well, I can come up with a way that, yes, it could create itself and insert, smartphone, whatever piece of technology that we're talking about, yes, it could happen, given enough time. Well, then I'm sorry. You have suspended all rationality in and critical thinking skills you were talking about, Emery. And it's like, what are we even arguing about? Because you're living in the atheist fantasyland projection complex I talk about, and it's on full display. Full, unabridged display of you are going to believe whatever is necessary to justify your worldview. You're not actually thinking critically.
And what's, a little bit heartbreaking, because I really like Ron Garrett, one of the sweetest guys I ever met, very civil, great humanitarian, very charitable, and donated a lot of money to charity, brilliant mind. But then we were talking about origin of life, and he said, yeah, I'm accepting it on faith. We got to that point because I was listing all the things in Changed Hands' book, and some of the experiments he was citing actually got just brutalized by Ryan Hayes and James Carter. And it's like, had I known that, I would have pointed it out to Ron. And he said, I'm just accepting it by faith. And that was a very honest admission on his part at that point. And I was shocked that he isn't looking at this more now. And, I just don't know what to say. So,
well, I think that he has a very strong case of Droid C, the desperate rejection of intelligent design complex.
Yeah.
It's on full display with all these guys. I mean, your point you made. How are you not even questioning this stuff?
Well, I was recently reading the book of Exodus, and God said, I'm hardening Pharaoh's heart and that of the Egyptians, and so that I may multiply my signs and wonders. I'm just like, yeah, I feel sorry for these guys because they've turned their heart away from God, and then God's, in some cases, he's just going to say, okay, I'm just going to let you guys go. I'm going to actually help you in that process because I'm going to make an example of you on Judgment Day. And that's really sobering. We keep saying, why do these guys behave like that? It's like, okay, a heart issue, but then God's going to even kind of throw a little gasoline on the fire and just kind of ensure for some of these guys, they're going to end up like Pharaoh. And that 2 Thessalonians 2:11 through 12. And it's been hard. I've realized I can't get upset about it. That's in a way part of the way God designed the way things are going to play out. And, come Judgment Day, he's going to say, see, I'm going to hold you accountable to all those stupid things you said. And you're in the leadership positions of society. You're well educated, and you're saying all those bad things about my design, and he's going to hold them accountable.
Yeah. At some point, like as much as like I don't like this, at some point you kind of have to just go, well, they've made a choice, and I can't talk them out of it.
Yep.
And I mean, there are certain people I can still have a conversation with. There are certain people in the community where it's just like, you've made up your mind. I don't think I can get through to you, even if I don't think. I mean, there are certain people I don't think even God coming down from and talking to them like he did to the Apostle Paul would get through to them. It's just, they don't want it.
When we have people like Dillahunty who literally state, I don't understand why God hasn't given me a Paul-like experience. Okay, cool. If he did, what would your response be? Well, I would reject it because I think that I'd be hallucinating. Okay, so if something did happen and you believe that the God did exist and he showed you that he existed, would you worship him? Absolutely not. I hate God. It's like, oh, and then you wonder why God doesn't waste his time with you when, per your own admission, even if you knew 100% he existed, you have the intention to reject. So I'm not really following your logic. Oh, wait, because there isn't any.
And there was someone I like personally on your channel, David Neff, and I was relating how there are people who said they'd rather go to hell than serve God, even if they had all the evidence. And David I think you remember that conversation. He said, I'm one of those. He said, I'd rather go to hell. I'm just like, oh, goodness. You're a nice guy too. Why?
Yeah, I mean, that's sad because, I mean, the little bit of interaction I've had with Neff, I like Neff. He's a nice kid, but...
Yeah.
I don't know why he's so
Neff is no longer a kid. He's 25. He's 26 years old. He's not a kid. He's 26.
Okay, fair enough.
We don't need. I understand why you would think that.
I didn't know how old he was. I just assumed he was a college student.
Oh no, I wasn't bashing you, Emery. I was just saying more the. I was trying to correct you. I was just more about because I had the exact same assumption. I thought he was maybe like 21, 22 years old, right? No, he's 26. And I'm like, yeah, okay. I give people a little more of a pass if they're, like even though Andrew Cumming, rational empiricist kid, even though he irritates the crap out of me, I try to give him a little bit of a pass because he's 17 years old. But anyway, sorry, Godzilla, I think I interrupted you, man.
I was surprised too. I didn't know that Neff was 26. He doesn't look that old.
Yeah, maybe he's a late bloomer. I was.
It's a good thing to look younger, though.
Yeah. Neff, I apologize for. I thought you were like 21, and I'm as old as I am. That's
and Neff, obviously, if you're listening by recording, whatever, it's obvious a lot of us like you as a person. We can't say that for other people, but we like you.
Yeah, there are people in the atheist community I could honestly say I don't like, but Neff's not one of them. But yeah, so I mean, it's just sad though that people make that choice, that they just decide, well, I don't really, even if God were to show up himself and give me an Apostle Paul experience, I still wouldn't believe in him. And you wonder why God hasn't showed up and done that. Well, it's because you've already made up your mind. You've already decided what you're gonna do.
Godzilla Freak, did you have anything on your heart? Thank you for joining the stream.
No problem. I think I have an interesting analogy to make with the relative fitness thing. So let's say we have like a really rich person, like a millionaire, and then we had someone living in poverty, right? And they were the population. So we're looking for the average wealth of the population. And let's say every day they take like some of their money and just throw it in a fire. Right, it just burns, and they're not making any either. So eventually, let's say after a month, the person in poverty has gotten rid of so much money that they can no longer sustain themselves, right? They can't buy food anymore, and they just die. So now they're eliminated from the population. Let's say the millionaire went from $1 million to $900,000. Well, now what you find is the average wealth of the population is actually increased by a pretty significant amount. It went from about 500,000 to about 450,000. But all that's happened is that everyone has lost money. It's just that the poor person got eliminated from the population completely.
Yes, and we call that sometimes when they say fitness is increasing. Another thing that's kind of unfortunate, they're not being sufficiently rigorous in their terminology. Sometimes it's the mean fitness. And so what you described there is the best guy really didn't even improve. But you could say the mean fitness of the population increased just because you eliminated the bad. And this is, again, more population genetics theatrics. And they're trying to give the impression complexity will evolve. They're not being straight up. And you gave great illustration right there.
Population genetics, in my opinion, and again, not every facet of it, but some of the tenets of it, I find them to be such a joke. Of like, well, listen, the mutation didn't happen in one part of the population. This is for population genetics. It didn't happen in like one organism. So were you suggesting that at some point the mutation that is necessary from a hypothetical perspective for the new function to occur, are you suggesting that they didn't have to happen and all of them didn't have to come into conjunction inside of at least one organism at some point before that new function could be spread throughout the population again? And I never get a straight answer. There's always some like blanket, I know this is population genetics, it's not in the entire population, like, blah, and like, at some point, in order for the new feature to be in existence, did there have to be a first organism that had all of the necessary components of the necessary gene sequences in order to have X function? Yes or no? And I've never gotten a straight answer.
And that's instead you'll just get what we call literature bluffing and then just obfuscation. So they'll say, look at all these papers you need to learn. And I got a lot of that. And it's because I came from its different scientific discipline where I wasn't treated that way, where questions were welcomed, and there was a serious attempt when I asked questions to respond in a way that wasn't condescending, one that was informative. And I never got that from them. And that just kind of irritated me more. I'm just like, you guys are acting like you're the most brilliant scientists. And it's like, I worked on spaceships. What have you done lately? Trying to build these phylogenies? I mean, I could draw those with Crayola crayons. I mean, that sounds kind of mean. In fact, I put down Michael Lynch personally. He sent me a nasty letter, and I sent him one back. I said, that's why I build spaceships, and you just build phylogenies that you can't prove, something like that. I just put him down because one of his graduate students overheard me, and I just mentioned Michael Lynch in passing because I was in that Nature paper, and Michael Lynch responded, and I was just mentioning that Michael Lynch got really upset, sent me he found my email. I don't know how he found it, and he wrote me personally. He said, ID's a hoax, and I said, I wrote him a nasty letter back. It probably wasn't the coolest thing to do, but I was pretty irritated. So I don't know that. But this whole thing about population genetics, partly the reason I got recruited to work on this, even though I didn't know biology 7 years ago. I mean, I had no formal training. It was because I recognized the math. And as I looked at the literature, I said, this is all theatrics. I mean, it just looks good. But at the bottom, there's nothing. I mean, I generated mathematical theatrics before. You just get Mathematica, you put a few equations. Oh my goodness, it'll just automatically generate it. It looks profound, but it's just garbage. And I'm just like, when I worked on a population genetics project last year, or the last year and a half, I said, I was asking my colleagues, I said, it can't be this bad. And they said, yeah, it is that bad.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people don't, and this includes me, don't understand the heavy math, and so when that gets put up in front of them, they either gloss it over or they just assume that the mathematicians know what they're talking about.
They know what they're talking about in terms of the math is okay. It's what it actually represents, which is nothing. And just simply saying, and I pointed this out to Dr. Carter. I said, how is it that we can say individuals lose genes, they reproduce more, therefore they're more fit? Population genetics does not distinguish between increase of complexity and loss of it. So loss of genes can be, say, an example of increasing fitness. I'm like, this is garbage. This is garbage if you're representing all your population genetics theory as proving evolution. I said, you prove nothing, because the real problem of evolution is not that we're proving natural selection causes change. It's whether natural selection accumulates complexity. And I said, you could take all those equations of population genetics that talk about fitness increase and say, okay, if that's gene loss, you've just proved that there's going to be gene loss over time. Where does that get you? It tells us humans shouldn't have evolved because we are much more complex than other creatures. And I said, and people have quietly realized that. They don't want to, I mean, they had at least enough integrity to publicly say it, but it ends up in obscure spots in various journals. And I'll give one example of that. While one of you is talking, I'm going to grab that specific example. It's kind of shocking.
I mean, I'm not surprised that it's been published. It's just the fact that people things show up in the literature that then never make it into the common press, and then never make it into the textbooks or into popular vernacular, because they just either are so technical that people aren't going to get it, or they are deliberately not talked about because that would undo X number of years worth of work. And unfortunately, the narrative is more important in a lot of cases than facts.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but a lot of the math of population genetics does not account for the recombinations that wouldn't actually be viable. Like they're saying, oh, there are enough hypotheticals that if we go down this rabbit hole, then we could result in, if these modifications happen at this rate, then we could go from this sequence to this sequence in terms of what would we have to be done in order for the new variation to occur. But it's like, okay, awesome, fantastic, that's great. Would one of those actually happen? Because what do we see? We see all sorts of controls that are in place to not allow all sorts of random actions to take place in terms of the modifications, and we see corrections, all these different roadblocks, if you will, that in the real world, not in your hypothetical, would stand in the way of these things being plausible. And it's like, to me, correct me if you guys think I'm wrong on this, but it seems to me that the plausibility filter is just completely removed from the equation in the quote-unquote conclusions that are reached.
That's true. Go ahead, Sal. And you're muted.
I found the quote. This is by Joe Felsenstein. He's probably the most respected population geneticist. This is an almost forgotten essay he wrote in the late 70s or 80s, early 80s. He said, many evolutionists, which I love that, he's calling them evolution. He's calling his colleagues evolutionists.
And per the YouTubers, evolutionist is not actually a word. Continue.
Yeah,
it's just a creationist made-up term.
Yes, we totally converted Joe Felsenstein to a creationist on the sly and had him put it in the technical literature. That totally happened.
And I'll give the citation here. Many evolutionists fail to find the clear and simple messages that population genetics theory once seemed to promise. I mean, that they're not able to. The idea was population genetics was going to help them solve to help improve their theory. And this paper was basically saying it's failing. He said the mathematical tools at hand have not revolutionized our understanding of the evolutionary process. And so let me give the citation, Joe Felsenstein, and this was Mathematics versus Evolution. Mathematics versus Evolution, and this was in Science, the prestigious journal Science, November 17, 1989. Sorry, it was the late 80s. And there were, the reason I came across this is I was recruited to do work that was looking at literature like this. It's just somewhat a literature review. And I was horrified. I found out, and Godzilla Freak gave an example there with the money. There's certain situations when we deal with genomes that have complex interactions, fitness doesn't even maximize. And they only were starting to come out with this. There was this paper. I'll give a quote on it, but the point is, it's out there in the literature, and I commend the integrity of some people being honest enough, and the editors letting it go. It's just like that paper that Emery and I read. What's wrong with evolutionary biology? And it's just not the popular science industry will not grab those papers and just flaunt them because it's embarrassing. They do have there's enough internal integrity that they'll start to admit this amongst themselves, and occasionally it'll get through a paper. And so this admission in population genetics was one example. And it's when I started saying, I thought this is garbage, and now you've confirmed it. So what's the deal? Why are you still defending this theory? And I realized it's a commitment. They're going to defend it. Even when they to themselves have admitted they don't have a case.
Right. It's a worldview commitment. They're not going to give it up for anything, because if they give it up, they know they have to consider the alternatives, and they don't want to do that.
Yeah. And same with some of the Origin of Life publications. Steve Benner said all the paradoxes of life. And I'm just like, you couldn't have written a better creationist essay. And why do you still, I mean, everything you've said is a reason I should reject naturalistic abiogenesis. And he said, oh, we're confident it will solve this. Maybe some experiment will find it. I'm just like, okay.
Yeah.
Hey guys, so just quick market research. So I've started creating some t-shirts. The one I'm working on right now, to get y'all's opinion, I think it's kind of a joke, but evolutionism, noun, the new flat earth.
I actually think it's more, just personally, I liken it to geocentrism, but that might be too sophisticated for some people to understand.
Well, the reason I was thinking, this is completely a pun, right? I'm obviously just poking fun. The part where the thought came from was, how the Evos all run around claiming that if you're a creationist, you must be flat Earth. I think it would be a kind of a little bit of a funny jab at. I'm debating between evolutionism and just evolution by itself for the shirt text. What do you guys think?
Yeah, that'd be interesting. That'd be very interesting. You're guaranteed to get commentary on that.
I don't know how they'd react if you wore that in public.
Okay, this was the headline. Oh. This was the headline. The theory was beautiful indeed, and this was July 2016. The rise and fall and circulation of maximizing methods in population genetics. They could have just dispensed with this thing of circulation. The rise and fall of maximizing methods in population genetics. It was talking about the collapse of some of their big aims, and this was just brutal. And it's like what ended up happening. I was one of the first on our little YouTube society here to be throwing this out, and it's like, yeah, people didn't know about this paper. And it talked about how okay, I'll give you an example. Richard Dawkins said, for example, Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection is the central theorem of biology. The central theorem of biology. And he doesn't understand what it is. Most biologists don't know what that central theorem states, but he's calling it a central theorem, and no one actually ever used it. And so we had this myth perpetuated for 80 years that it's the central theorem of biology.
Yeah, I saw your video on it, Sal, or your presentation. It's like Fisher's theorem just says that if the net effect of mutations is neutral and it follows this bell curve, then fitness will increase.
Oh, it was terrible. But what I was pointing out, this myth was perpetuated, and it's on the Royal Society webpage. The Fisher came up with the central theorem of biology. Most biologists don't know what that supposed central theorem is, and it doesn't work anyway. But it just goes to show how long even when internally, like the population geneticists knew that this was a flawed theorem, or one that wasn't, it was good as far as it goes, but its applicability was questionable. And many have later said it's had a negative assessment, but all the momentum, all the cultural momentum will just keep promoting it as being real long after it's falsified. That's why Jonathan Wells calls it zombie science. Even long after an idea has been shown to be wrong, it just persists in the culture. And what's really sad, even in science textbooks, I think Emery was mentioning something about Haeckel's embryos or something.
Yep. Haeckel's embryos is just, I have a biology textbook from not that long ago that still has a variant of Haeckel's embryos in it. It's insane. Absolutely insane. And the evolutionists get very upset when we bring up Haeckel's embryos. And they're like, oh, yeah, well, we know that's debunked. Well, yeah, get it out of the textbooks then. That's how you're muted.
You know it's debunked and stop teaching it.
Yeah, exactly. Like the whole creationism is... I don't know if you guys saw the Snopes article that went after creationists a while back, but that was one of the things he brought up in the article was, we know that Haeckel's embryos has been debunked, but it's right in theory. He actually said that. No, I'm not joking. He actually said, yeah, well, we know that the Haeckel's embryos were wrong, but the theory behind it was right. And he's like, well, nobody uses that anymore. And I'm like, oh, you gotta be kidding me. I have textbooks that still use this. Are you? And we would stop complaining about it if you would stop using it.
Yeah, the fact check websites, they're just it's just the worst.
Yeah, someone needs to fact check them. That'd be a whole cottage industry fact checking the fact checkers.
Yeah. I did want to Godzilla Freak, did you have something on your mind?
No, you guys can just keep going.
I'm gonna since this was a after show for organized for Dr. Carter, I did mention during the show in the chat, I said Michael Behe has done quite a lot, and so I do appreciate the fact that Dr. Carter mentioned Dr. Sanford, but Michael Behe has done an awful lot and published a lot of stuff on the Lenski experiment. And I'd like to just read that because I felt he has actually a very nice writing style, very accessible to read. And I'm just going to share that. I do like reading things just verbatim because I'm going to totally mess it up if I try to summarize it. So this was June 18th, 2020. This is very recent. Michigan State University biologist Richard Lenski and collaborators have just published a terrific new paper in the journal eLife. Anyone who wants to see a crystal clear example of the inherent, unavoidable, fatal difficulties that Darwinian mechanisms itself poses for unguided evolution should read it closely. The paper concerns the further evolution of a widely discussed mutant strain of the bacterium E. coli discovered during the course of Lenski's long-term evolution experiment, LTEE. The LTEE is his more than 3 decades long project in which E. coli was allowed to grow continuously in laboratory flasks, simply to observe how it would evolve. As I've written before, almost all the beneficial mutations that were discovered to have spread through the population of bacteria in the LTEE were ones that either blunted pre-existing genes, decreasing their previous biochemical activity, or outright broke them. An interesting exception? There seemed, however, to be one interesting exception. One morning, after more than 30,000 generations of bacterial growth, one flask of E. coli out of 12 separate flasks that Lenski maintained for comparison and replication's sake seemed cloudier than the other 11 flasks. That indicated substantially more bacteria than usual had grown in nutrient broth. After much hard laboratory work, Lenski's group showed that the region of the prodigious bacterium's DNA that was close to a gene coding for a citrate transporter, that is, a protein whose job is to bring external dissolved citrate into the cell. Citrate is a common chemical that cells metabolize, had duplicated. The duplication mutation placed the control region of a different gene next to that of the citrate transporter. Here's why that helped. The citrate transporter gene's natural regulatory causes the gene to be turned off whenever oxygen is around. As it was under the normal laboratory growth conditions at MSU. The second regulator, however, allows the gene it controls to be turned on in the presence of oxygen. The mutation that placed a copy of the regulator of the second gene next to the citrate gene then allowed the citrate gene to be turned on in the presence of oxygen too. Since for technical purposes there was a lot of dissolved citrate in the nutrient broth, the mutant E. coli could import and metabolize, eat, the citrate, which was unavailable to non-mutants. With all that extra food, the mutant grew like crazy, quickly surpassing non-mutants. The novel result was widely reported, and the conjecture was floated that perhaps the mutant was on its way to forming a new species. As I wrote in Darwin Devolves, however, other much more ominous genetic results should have tempered any optimism. For example, the citrate mutant had accumulated many of the same beneficial but degradative mutations that had previously spread through the population. The new mutation could not restore them, and later work showed that several more broken genes had been selected in the mutant, apparently to help it metabolize citrate more efficiently. A sick puppy. The new paper now reports on 2,500 generations of further evolution of the citrate mutant in nutrient media that contains either citrate alone or citrate plus glucose, as for earlier generations. As always, with the Lenski lab, the research is well and thoroughly done, but the resulting E. coli is one sick puppy. Inside the paper, they report, quote, the spectrum of mutations identified in evolved clones was dominated by structural variation, including insertions, deletions, and mobile element transpositions, end quote. All of these are exceedingly likely to break or degrade genes. Dozens more genes were lost. The citrate mutant tossed genetic information with mindless abandon for short-term advantage. In a particularly telling result, the authors serendipitously discovered evidence of substantial cell death in cultures of a citrate plus clone sampled from the LTEE at 50,000 generations. In other words, those initial random beneficial citrate mutations that had been seized on by natural selection tens of thousands of generations earlier had led to a death spiral. The death rate of the ancestor of the LTEE was 10% after 33,000 generations. It was 30% after 50,000. It was 10% after 33,000 generations. It was 30% after 50,000, 40%. For the newer set of experiments, the death rate varied for different strains of cells in different media, but exceeded 50% for some cell lines in citrate-only environment. Indeed, the authors identified a number of mutations, again, almost certainly degradative ones. In genes for fatty acid metabolism, they write with admirable detachment, suggest adaptation to scavenging on dead and dying cells. The degraded E. coli was eating its dead. Okay, cannibalism at the bacterial level. Lessons to draw. Let me emphasize, the only result from the decades-long 50,000 plus generation E. coli evolution experiment that seemed at first blush like it had a bit of potential to yield a novel pathway in the bacterium has resulted instead in spectacular devolution. As Lenski and co-authors wrote in Science in 2019 in their dismissive review of Darwin Devolves, which they focus strongly on the clear degradation over occurring over the course of LTEE. Quote, there are indeed many examples of loss of function mutations that are advantageous, but Behe is selective in his examples. He dedicates the better part of chapter 7 to discussing a 65 generation Escherichia coli experiment, emphasizing the many mutations that arose that degrade function, an expected mode of adaptation to a simple laboratory environment, by the way, while dismissing improved functions and deriding one new one as a sideshow. Full disclosure, the findings in question were published by co-author Richard Lenski. The one new function was a citrate mutation. I'd called it a sideshow in Darwin Devolves precisely because the E. coli of the LTEE were accumulating degraded mutations much faster than any mutations that might with charity be called constructive. Interesting as it is, the ambiguous citrate mutation that started the hoopla is a sideshow. The overwhelmingly important and almost completely unnoticed lesson is that the genes are being degraded left and right, both when they directly benefit the bacteria and when they do so indirectly in support of another mutation. The occasional particularly noticeable modification of function or gain of FCT mutation can't turn back the tide of damaging and loss of FCT ones. That's a unique term that Behe coined, FCT. The more molecular evolutionary works that rolls in, the more the above conclusions become a mere truism, a great strength. In their new paper, the Lenski group rightly points out that the great strength of its experimental evolutionary system. It is rarely feasible to examine evolution in action as organisms invade, colonize, and adapt to a new niche in nature, especially with independently evolving replicates and control populations. In the study, we investigated how E. coli variants with the new ability to grow aerobically on citrate adapted to a novel citrate-only resource environment in the laboratory. Exactly. That means the LTEE gives us our clearest insight into the general effects of Darwin's mechanism, which continues to operate no matter what other processes may also be occurring. I'm looking at you, extended evolutionary synthesis. No matter whether an organism is in the lab or in the wild, no matter which kind of organism, whether microbe, plant, or animal, is subject to its tender care. So thanks to the Lenski group, we know that devolution is relentless. It never rests. In good times and bad, if a change in a species could help it adapt more closely to its environment, degradative mutations will arrive most quickly by far to offer their assistance. And of course, under selective pressure, a species has no choice but to accept helpful ones, even if that eventually leads to the species languishing. Thanks in very large part to the fine work done over decades at Michigan State, we can now be certain that, like citrate-eating E. coli as an explanation for the great features of life, Darwin's theory itself is in a death spiral. So I wanted to share that. I felt that said it all.
That was very good. That was very good. And I'm going to drop on that note because I need to go get some homework done. But thank you, Sal, very much for having me in, and and thank you for reading that off. It was very good.
Thank you, Emery. And
have a good night, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Have a good night.
Yep. Have a good one.
If anyone wants to join the stream, I may close her down soon, but if someone wants to talk about something on their mind related to evolution, this experiment, feel free to join. Otherwise, I'll close the stream. It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, that paper is. I've read that one as well. It's very there's not really any mercy given. On just kind of like, at some point, are we going to accept the obvious like this, or are we just going to keep trying to come up with extenuated synthesis, or that's what I call it. The official name is what, extended modern synthesis, or whatever they call it. Well, I think case in point. Have you watched the original lecture where Dennis Noble just eviscerates neo-Darwinism?
No, I heard about it. I didn't.
You guys should find it on YouTube. It's there's one of the lectures he did on it was in China, actually, and it was just a brutal call out of oh man, what's the guy from the University of Chicago who just went off? He goes off hardcore on anybody's ID, but anybody who disagrees with traditional evolutionary models, they're nuts. I forget the guy's name, but he's a pretty well-known character. Anyway, Noble just like went off on him, and it's like, so this is disproven. This doesn't work. This doesn't work. This doesn't work. We have to count for this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. We don't have an answer for that. So therefore, if the foundational principles have been utterly annihilated, just because you don't want to admit and to accept the fact that this is the reality, and we now know beyond doubt there's all these new variables that we have to account for that we know 100% are not accountable from the original foundation of the model. At what point do we have to come up with a new model? And this is right around the time the whole third wave conference is being put on. And I remember listening to it, the first time I listened to it, I was just sitting there thinking, Noble, you recognize that the entire foundation is nuts and disproven. But even so, you're wanting to come up with a new model to account for it. This one is wrong, but it's like, well, there must be some other explanation. And it's like, yeah, the other explanation is that there was a intelligent agent that was required to pull this off. Like, yeah, that's the answer to the question.
I think it's really funny when you have people with alternative views of evolution other than Darwinism or neo-Darwinism, and instead of making any points for their view, all they do is they attack the Darwinist view, and they think after they've done that, well, obviously now it's my type of evolution that comes out on top, without any defense of it. It's like, yeah, we won because they're the only other option. And it's funny because they just don't realize that there is a creationist option. They don't consider it.
So Sal, did you know that the Sumerians did trigonometry? The Sumerians.
Oh, wow. Oh, greetings, Jungle Jargon.
Greetings.
Yeah,
I was watching a documentary on Sumerians, and they did, really complex math equations and everything, and way back from the beginning, they were doing trigonometry to calculate the position of the stars and everything.
But Jungle, they didn't have a smartphone and a scientific calculator. How were they being able to do this math?
Yeah, you can do.
Well, they had the batteries too. They had the Baghdad batteries and the metal plating and stuff.
But how are they doing that math? Did they have paper?
I don't think
on clay tablets. I don't know.
Oh, they're doing it on clay, man. So they were like chiseling in the equations, man. That's some serious dedication.
Imprint, and they had the wheel too. As a matter of fact, they had wheel seals.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I think it's fascinating, and it's amazing. I'm more poking fun at the.
I know.
People think we can, but more beyond that, I'm poking fun at the modern educators who think we don't actually need to teach people how to do the math. We just need to show them which buttons to push on a calculator.
Yeah, I get that a lot because I'm in high school right now, and they just push their buttons. Meanwhile, I'm doing everything by hand.
Godzilla, I didn't know you were in high school.
Did you know?
I didn't know that. No.
I'm 16.
Oh, nice. Now I had an interaction with a group of high school teachers a couple years ago, and I was going on a tirade about how my daughter was being taught math in elementary school, and then extrapolated out. We had more in-depth conversation, and I was informed that they had been informed when they were learning to be teachers that they didn't need to focus on teaching like all the steps and all these different things and the fundamentals of the formulas and actually how to do the math on paper. That was a waste of time, and they were being educated to educate people to push the buttons. And I was like, okay, there's a lot of problems with that. But what do you think's gonna what do they do if they don't have their calculator? And the response I got was, well, you can get that on your smartphone now. And my mouth fell open with that response. I thought they were being sarcastic, and then I kind of looked at them again. I'm like, oh my lord, they're being serious. And these girls were probably all, I'd say they were all under the age of 30, probably 25, 26, not long out of college. And I'm just like, we are doomed. Society is doomed if we're teaching teachers to not actually teach people how the fundamental principles of how to do things. Like when the inevitable, power grid collapse, something like that happens, we're toast. Like humanity is going to end at that point if that ever happens, because people won't be able to do the basics.
People
I
go
don't
tribal.
use a calculator. So while everyone else in the class for Shrek, they just push the buttons. I memorize my ratios from my sine ratios from 1 to 90. I just did it that way.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll tell you something else that's amazing. I've been dealing with this with my daughter. There's in elementary school, there's now a concept that it's not beneficial to memorize the multiplication and division tables, even 1 to 12. And I about had a conniption when I had this conversation at one of the parent-teacher things. And I was like, so I use those calculations on a daily basis. Like, heck, if I go to the grocery store, I do the math on how much money I'm going to spend in my head, even if it's might not be the exact math, but at least ballpark it. And very often, I say 99% of the time, I'm using the basic multiplication division tables that I memorized when I was 8 or whatever, however old I was when I did that. And you're telling me there's no benefit to this? You guys don't see a benefit to this. What do you? I was at loss for word. I'm like, I don't even know how to address this. This is such a completely illogical conclusion to be reached. I'm like, who came up with this policy? That's what I want to know. Who came up with these policies? This is just dumb.
Teaching not to teach.
Math without your multiplication table. Are you gonna count them out every time?
I don't know. That's what I was thinking. I'm like, what? How does this make sense? And now with the Common Core stuff, they're teaching. This has been blowing my mind. Instead of I remember when my daughter was being taught basic arithmetic, and I'm looking at her homework stuff, and they've got everything the numbers horizontally rather than stacked. You weren't supposed to add everything up, carry the 1 or whatever number it is, and then do it. You're supposed to do all this stuff in your head when you're in 3rd grade, learning the principles of arithmetic.
Yeah, so some parts of it, they make it super easy. You don't have to do anything. And then other parts, they make it 1,000 times harder. You have no clue what you're doing.
Well, absolutely. And I'm like, so why would you not be adding, stacking all the numbers and doing that? What I'm finding very disturbing about what's happening in education is they keep we're coming up with these new ways to do things. And I'm like, so the old ways weren't broken. They've worked for literally thousands of years. There's a high probability it's how you learned it. And now you're going to come up with some new hypothetical way a new process to teach people something the basics? The basics. And that one I'm like, so you're dumbing people down on purpose. And the part that really pisses me off, excuse my French, and this applies to what you're talking about, Godzilla. It is a known fact that in adolescence, specifically, when you're learning the higher level concepts, it is a known fact that different structures of your brain are being formed. We know this. And there's direct ramifications in terms of your adulthood in relation to your adulthood, in respect to your critical thinking skills, your ability to analyze information, because those neural pathways are literally being created when you're in your adolescence for a lot of those higher level brain functions. And it's like, if we know this, why would we remove that type of education from the classroom when it can be formed, and then have some kind of we just can't explain why kids going to college are having to go take remedial education? It's because they never formed the structure in their, not only the knowledge, but they literally didn't form lots of the portions of their brain structure that would make it easier for them to learn it. And not just in terms of the math, but fast forward out of college, and this is what's happening. There's major ramifications in the job markets, industry, of businesses are hiring kids that supposedly have the qualifications coming out of college. They get them in the workspace, and they can't think. They cannot think for themselves, and they cannot put 1 + 1 together, or 1 + 2 equaling 3. They can't figure it out for themselves. They cannot add 1 + 2 and have to look in this new scenario they've never experienced before, and come to a novel solution. And it's well, what do we think is going to happen? We didn't teach people some of the fundamentals. We didn't help to create those structures in the brain which enable them to look at different things and create a unified solution to a problem they haven't faced before. And it's sorry for my tangent, but it's really getting concerning to me of what's being done to the youth of our societies.
Yeah, I think the points are important to make regarding just how degraded education has become.
At work, they wouldn't hesitate to say, if you got a question, ask somebody else who knows. Because a lot of people didn't even know what they were doing. And so they just made it a habit of telling people to ask somebody else who does know.
Well, and in a lot of things, the irony for me, and your point about that curiosity, is, I think this is a major issue too, of the removal of the, not completely removal, but a massive reduction in the principle or the concept of apprenticeship. And when I think back to the different scenarios in which I've learned things directly from somebody else, you can acquire understanding and application of that knowledge so much faster in that context than the purely classroom model. And it's yeah, you can learn the principles of X, but, and I don't just mean this from I agree with the mechanic, for example. Yeah, you need to understand the principles of how the internal combustion engine works, how braking works, all these different things. You need to know those fundamentals. But then, in terms of actually being able to efficiently execute, well, both diagnose and then execute the correction to whatever is broken down, a lot of that's going to be derived from your real world application of those skills, and then being able to talk to somebody who's run into the same problem 100 times and be oh, well, this is how you solve that one. And it's that being the standard or recognized beneficial element to learning has been ostracized in many ways in modern education.
Yeah, you got to learn from somebody who knows, especially when dealing with theology and things like that too.
Just a side comment. I know I feel really bad about this, John. I promised you those sequences and some graphs. I never got around to it. I guess I got so overwhelmed with the Friday night after show that went on for 7 hours. I totally forgot to say that. I just wanted to extend my personal.
Oh, that's no worries. That's no worries, man. It's not a big deal, and to be honest, in relation to Danny Boy, it wouldn't have made any difference.
Yeah, John, I borrowed part of your video, and I made a video myself about Dan Cardinal.
Oh, did you? I'll have to check that out. Have you posted it already?
Yeah.
Dude, I get, it's so weird. I get notified on your live streams. I don't get notified for anything else.
Well, you have
very
to realize
weird.
YouTube's just like really horrible sometimes.
Well, true. And I keep, what's really getting annoying is I'll have like the all notifications denoted. And then I'm like, man, I haven't heard from so-and-so in a while. I'll like go search their channel, go there, recheck my notifications, and it will be like on the sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's like, I didn't change this. Why has it been changed?
Yeah, and they have this weird thing where if they upload more than like 3 videos within a day, you stop getting notifications. It's like, why? I just put all for a reason, you know? If they upload a 4th video, I don't want to just not know about it.
Right. Well, I would imagine there's probably some additional algorithm they have set up for like, probably based on your number of subscriptions. And there's probably some, I'd be very surprised they haven't come up with some weird, not weird, some specific formula of like, if you have more than X subscriptions that post more than X notifications, then, minimize, X, Y, Z. I'd be stunned if they don't have some kind of protocol that's accounted for that. But they don't think we can account. Like, I guess they don't think, I wonder if the human, if they get annoyed with the number of notifications, is not just going to go, like, turn off the notifications. Let's do that for them.
Right.
A total off topic. This will be quick. Burning question I meant to ask you for a long time, John. Was there one time you mistook Jim Majors for T-Jump or vice versa? Because when you were talking, I said, it took a while for me to distinguish them.
I don't think I've ever no. T-Jump and Jim Majors, no. Are you referring to is the impetus for that question, does that stem from the call out I did of Jim Majors?
No, there's one time you're interacting with him and you're saying that you talked about this or that. And I said, I think you're talking about T-Jump. I wanted to weigh in and say, hey, I think you're remembering a conversation you had with T-Jump, not Jim Majors.
Do you remember what the topic was? No.
But the reason it stood out is for a while I couldn't tell the two apart. I'm not very good at recognizing faces. It's caused. I mean, there's some people that actually have that, and I'm one of them.
Gotcha. Now I don't think I would have my major thing with Jim Majors was that there's like email correspondence of this. He and I. Okay, so number one, in my debate with Skylar Fiction, in the Q&A. He talked mad trash and said he wanted to debate me. I said, let's do it whenever, let's go. Standing for Truth then had ongoing email correspondence with him back and forth to set up a debate for myself and Jim Majors. It was scheduled. Praise I Am That I Am created the thumbnail. The stream was up, ready to roll. I reset my schedule to make time for this debate. He emails and says, hey, can we push it back a couple hours? I agree. He never shows. Okay? The next day, he's doing a live stream. I go to his live stream. I'm like, bro, where were you? Like, what happened? Because he'd been talking all this trash, right? In his live stream, he claims he doesn't know what I'm talking about. Oh. Fast forward to another debate. Same type of thing, trash talking happens. And I'm like, let's do the debate, unless you don't remember. We then have this ongoing back and forth on Twitter where he's categorically refusing to even to admit that there was ever even communication about a debate. I then get standing to show the emails where there's communication back and forth between the two of them. So that's what I did. Then I did my live stream where I was like, I forget the exact title, but it was basically, is Jim Major stupid or just high all the time? And has he forgotten? Because he was denying that there was ever anything scheduled. And there's like email correspondence that proves that there was. So anyway, the long story short on that tangent is I don't think I misinterpreted T-Jump and Jim Majors. Because
thank you.
We had... we've had some significant back and forth between the two of us. Although at this point, he literally, I think he does get so high that he forgets interactions he's had.
Wow. So thank you for answering my burning question.
That's I can't imagine ever being in the mental state where I would, set up this whole thing and then just completely forget about it.
Well, I tell you what's interesting to me, and this corresponds with my debate with Skylar Fiction on the topic of should marijuana be legalized. I was citing papers that show beyond doubt that executive function is deprecated significantly by the chemicals in weed, and that while you can recover your executive function, it's negated. It's like dramatically minimized in comparison to the average person. Number two, if you are a heavy user, not only does the deprecation of different cognitive abilities get deprecated, yes, when you are high, you can regain them to a degree. However, what you're able to get while you're high is still less than what your normal would be if you were not under the influence. It's like, so kind of like the point you and Emery were talking about earlier, Sal, of like the ANCAT, you guys talking about in terms of the net reduction in fitness. Same kind of thing with being high versus not high. Like, yeah, you're a stoner, therefore you have slightly greater function when you're stoned versus when you're sober, but you would still have a net high point that is lower than what you would be if you weren't high. You never got high at all. So which one has a greater benefit? Like, you have reduced your own cognitive ability. Your maximum cognitive ability has been deprecated. And Jim Majors and Skylar Fiction and a bunch of their advocates still run around claiming that that's false. And I'm like literally reading it from a paper. I'd like to show this.
Your relative intelligence has gone up, see, compared to when you're off it. Right, the relative.
Right, exactly. And I'm like, so let's on purpose. Let's make people dumber. Got it.
Well, but they should know themselves that they're not able to function as well or think as well when they're high.
Well, yeah, but they're from their perspective as a consistent stoner, from their anecdotal perspective, they actually are being able to operate at a higher level when they're stoned than when they're not. But it's not as good as they would be. So from their perspective, man, I'm way more productive when I'm high. So,
right.
Congratulations. So you're net dumber. Got it.
You think profound thoughts too, except when you're not high, you think how stupid it was.
Wow. And that's surprising. I mean, he struck me as being very articulate. Jim, I was actually pretty impressed. I said, this guy's brilliant. And I don't say that about a lot of, guys on the other side. I was very impressed. So it's just like, oh, well, first impressions aren't always the most accurate.
I don't question. I think that Jim Majors is not an idiot. I mean, he's not intellectually. He doesn't have a low IQ, obviously. And he has a lot of knowledge. But he doesn't have, in my opinion, he's got a very finite perspective. Yeah. And a sidebar, that's something I've been really starting to come to appreciate and recognize, is the significant reduction in perspective that is the end result of atheism.
Right. I'm still wondering about the IQ thing.
Guys, I might have to wrap it up. I'm just running out of gas. I did show some things in the this is what I wanted to share with John on his talk, and I'll just share it with the audience since I failed to produce it for him for his Dr. Dan thing, but this is a segment of a bacterial genome, and you can see it doesn't immediately tell you where the coding region is. I had to click a special thing here to identify it, and you can see it's highlighted here. And when I put it in, when I put that DNA sequence in this translate thing, it's going to translate it to through the genetic code, and it'll translate it. So the lowercase letters are the DNA, and the uppercase letters are the amino acids that it codes for. And that's all I wanted to show. I was hoping to have sent that to John before Sunday.
But Sal, there's no source to target alphabet. I tell you what really blew my mind about that whole deal, and I think just proved beyond doubt that Dan didn't actually listen to anything I was talking about before and after. He didn't really. I mean, I don't know if it's source and target in terms of like obviously codon to amino acid. I'm like, so what is it then? I mean, you have something that literally fulfills every single aspect of, from a formal language theory standpoint, that is code, beyond doubt. It fulfills every single one of the fundamentals. And does the the part that always blows my mind, and it's amazing how many evolutionary activist jokers on YouTube will make this argument. They or don't know this. They want to say that the codon chemically turns into the amino acid. They actually think that. And it's like, what? Number one, you think there's a chemical reaction where the amino acid, the codon turns into, like the molecularly turns into the amino acid? And I've had people say yes to that. And I'm just like, what? What? My mind gets blown.
And what's very powerful is this sequence ATGC or AAC. Craig Ventnor or any of these synthetic genetic engineers, this sequence could be just stored in a computer. And so it goes, so again, the information is able to transfer over a variety of mediums. First, it's in the silicon chips or whatever, the hard drive or whatever, and then it ends up coding to these amino acids. So I just in this with the audience because I should have gotten it to John for his Sunday show. And so you did pay out Dr. Dan $500?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I originally, it's kind of funny. They were like all running around claiming that, well, first everybody was, all the Evos were running around claiming that I was never going to pay out a winner. And then now, because I did exactly what I said I was going to do, if they crack the code, then Dan somehow won, which I think is hysterical. Well, it's like the entire time he didn't understand what I was saying.
It was like it's like you used intelligence and code breaking techniques to crack the code.
Did he break it manually?
He claimed to have used an Excel spreadsheet and a identify frequency. I'm pretty sure, and then later on he admitted that there was somebody else that helped him. So I think he claimed to have read a book on code cracking a long time ago, and then was applying some of those principles. But then he also admitted somebody else helped him crack it. So I don't know. Who knows exactly what the process that was utilized, but I don't know. It was interesting. But
I guess the thing is, you can't crack a code unless you assume there's a code.
Right. Well, that was kind of the point. That was kind of the point that I was making. Yeah. And Sal, I'm sharing my screen real quick. The point that you were just making about storing in different places, right? So this is the headline: Programming language automates generation of plug-and-play DNA. So you're talking about mediums, but also translations, right? Biological engineers based at a Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, report that they have created a programming language that allows even biology's newbies to rapidly design complex DNA-encoded circuits to give new functions to living cells. These engineers, under the leadership of MIT's names, blah, 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 base their language on Verilog, which is commonly used to program computer chips. After the Verilog code is generated in a design environment called cellular logic, it is automatically transformed into a DNA sequence. Algorithms build up a circuit diagram, assign and connect gates, and stimulate performance. Yada, yada, yada. There's like a whole exposition on it. How do you do code mapping for the Verilog code to be assigned to a sequence of DNA? You can't do this. Whole reason in the presentation where I like explained what code mapping was, gave an example, all that kind of stuff, was so that when you get to something like this in terms of the genetic code, it's like you either have to be living in a freaking fantasy land, refusing to accept any and all rationality of all the principles of communication that we know beyond doubt are directly applicable to not just the genetic code, the organic codes, right? We know these are required, and yet they want to claim that there's no comparison. It's not the same thing. And it's just, and Dan, case in point, it's natural. It's a natural code. It's a natural code. It's a natural code. It doesn't apply because it's a natural code.
Right.
And well, then how in the heck can Verilog code be translated directly into a gene sequence?
How can the code write itself? That's what I want to know. And that's what Dan believes. Dan believes it's a natural thing that code writes itself. But how does it do that? There's no mechanism for the code to write itself.
And just as a point to make to some of the other Evo atheists like Erica, who even deny that it's a literal code, even Dan is admitting that the genetic code is a code, right? Even Dan admits this.
Well, last night he tried to kind of off-play it, but I kept grilling him on it because when he was the only one who ended up actually being willing to back it up, I'm like, because he's danced and dodged, and I have an email thread with him where early in an email thread, he refused to delineate which one it was. And part of the reason in my interaction with him where I was like, so we have Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, assistant teaching professor at Rutgers University, who currently educates freshmen and sophomores in biology and teaches them about the genetic code. So Dan, what do you tell them? Is it a literal or a figurative code? It's like, no. Oh, no, right now in this, we're not going to dance around this. We're not going to give some freaking hypotheticals. Oh, it's analogous. No, it's simile. Which one is it? Is it literal or figurative? I'm not going to play this game. And because I'm done with that whole dance around the campfire, and we're not actually going to decide which one it is. And because when they do that, it enables them to try, at least in their own mind, to circumvent the fundamental requirements for it. And I mean, even in the and Dan, I know you, Sal, I know you don't like to go down this rabbit hole and stuff, but like part of the reason I read from one of Yaki's papers was he literally in the paper delineates that the message of the genetic message is immaterial and is recorded in material, but the meaning is immaterial. And it's like, so if the meaning is immaterial, then that means that obviously it's all proven beyond doubt, but like there is semantics. So how do you assign semantics to deterministic chemistry? Oh wait, you can't. Like there is no plausible scenario in which semantics can be applied.
But how does DNA make a human every time? It's got to be by way of instructions. It has to be by way of commands and orders. It's not complicated. I mean,
well, of course there is. And
all you have to do is see the end result. It's got to be programmed to make a human every time.
Yep. Well, guys, I know Sal's got to wrap up. I've got to jump off. It was great talking with y'all. Hope everyone has a great night. And
that was a fun after show.
We can go around, and if people want to give a last word, and then I'll give some announcements and shut it down.
Yeah, I just I made a video for Dan Cardinal, and if anybody wants to watch it, he believes that the code writes itself, so and there's no mechanism for that. I mean, how much does the genome have to suffer dysfunction and deletions before it gets a viable new function? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But anyway, that's it. That's my rant.
Okay. If you have mod privileges, you're welcome to put a link in the.
Oh, well, yeah, I don't know if I can do that right now. I'm on my phone. But
Gotcha. Tomorrow there'll be an open. There will be an after show for James' tour. I believe I'm going to be, unfortunately, in conflict with an event happening on Standing for Truth channel. Let me see. There is a creationist calendar of event. There's an events calendar for. Let me put it in the chat. There's an events calendar that I try to maintain, and I'm going to put it in the chat right now. It'll show all the events. So tomorrow, I'm just going to highlight this for tomorrow.
Oh, wow. I'll see you then, Sal. I'll see you.
Okay, take care.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
God bless. Thanks for dropping in.
Yeah.
And I'm having a hard time with the bringing up the Keep and Share calendar. Let me see if I could bring it up just for my own benefit. So tomorrow, yes, SFT will have something on diamonds, but at the same time, I'll be doing my after show for James' tour, because occasionally I will have some people that are, some of my subscribers are not necessarily the ones that watch SFT. We do definitely have overlap, but so I'm just announcing that. So James' tour tomorrow will be covering lipids, and I'd like to thank Pigs Can Fly for his thoughts for my mother and I, and every day is something to be grateful for, that she's still with me. She was sent home to die 3 years ago, and she's still alive, and I just take it day by day. So with that, it's been an enjoyable live stream, and it's been a great opportunity to fellowship. This is kind of like hanging out and fellowshipping with my brothers and sisters. So I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today, and God willing, I'll see you all, some of you all tomorrow. Take care, and God bless you.